From this lecture, we're going to start Redux. So what is Redux? Redux is used mostly for application state management. To summarize it, Redux maintains the state of an entire application in a single immutable state tree, or you can say in an immutable state object, which can't be changed directly. Context API and Redux have the same concept. They help us to store the state in a container, or you can say in a store. Building Redux is entirely different from the Context API. So let's first understand how Redux works in the React application. So how Redux works? The way Redux works is simple. There is a central store that holds the entire state of your application. Each component can access the store state without having to send down props from one component to another. There are main three building parts of the Redux: action, store, and reducer. Let's briefly discuss what each of them does. So let's start with the action. Action are event. They are the only way you can send the data from your application to the Redux store. In Redux, you send the data to the store using an action event. The data can be from user interaction, API calls, or even from form submissions. Action are sent using the store dispatch method. Action must also have a payload that contains the information that should be worked on by the action. Actions are created via an action creator. For example, to create an action, you just simply create a simple JavaScript object. And inside that object, you have a type of action and a payload. You first specify which type of action you are creating. You can notice here, we are creating a type of create action. And in the payload, we pass the data we want to send to the store. We specify the type, object, and then pass the payload. Payload is just the information we pass to the store when the create event happen, or you can say when the create action happen. Just after that, we have reducer. So let's see what reducer is. Reducer are pure functions that take a current state of an application, performs an action, and return a new state. These states are stored as an object, and they specify how the state of an application changes in response to an action sent to the store. Basically, reducer takes the current state of the application, and as a second parameter, it takes an action and then return a new state. Understanding how reducer work is important because they perform most of the work. So let's see how to create a reducer. To create a reducer, we simply create a function. You can create a function with a function keyword as well, or you can create a variable and then pass arrow function to it. Here I created a variable reducer and pass an arrow function to it. Inside this arrow function, I have two parameters, state and action. And then I just return updated state to the reducer function. Reducer is a pure function. We're not going to use any external value inside the reducer. That is why we call it pure function. When the action is triggered, we call the reducer of that action and return the initial or the updated state depending on the condition we have in the reducer. Right now you can notice inside the reducer we are returning the updated state. Next we have store. So what is store? Store holds the application state. Inside the store, Redux will store all your state data. It is highly recommended to keep only one store in any Redux application. In the store, you can access the state stored, update the state, and register or unregister the listener via the helper method. Let's see how to create a store. To create a store, you can just simply create a variable, store, and then call a function, create store. We get this function from the Redux library. So before we add this function, we need to import the Redux library inside the file and import this create store function from it. And then we can use this function to create a new store. Action perform on the state always return a new state. So these are three important concepts of Redux. There have been other important concepts as well in Redux. We will look at that step by step. If you want to know more about Redux, head on to redux.js.org. And from this website, you can get more information about Redux. So enough theory. Next, we are going to take a look at how to create a store, reducer, and action in Redux. Now, let's take a look at how to create a store, reducer, and action in the React application. In the previous lecture, we understand what is store, reducer, and action. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how you can add all these three important concepts in your React application. Redux is a simple 2 KB library. You can just simply add this library in your React application by using npm install command. So you just need to open your terminal, change your directory and enter into your project directory. Inside your project directory, you need to just execute a command npm node package manager I for install and then install Redux. Along with that, you need a library React Redux. So I'm going to install that as well. So I'm going to say here React Redux. Make sure the name of both these libraries is exactly same. Otherwise, you will get an error message. So I'm going to just install Redux and React Redux in my application first. So I'm going to press enter here. This will just take a few seconds to install both this library in my application. Once I've done that, let me clear the screen, back to my bash 1 and restart my server like this. So let's first understand how to create an action. So I'm going to just create a new folder inside this source folder right here. I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to name it Redux. And inside this Redux folder, I'm going to create a new file and name this file Redux info.js. Inside this Redux info, let me first create Redux action. So as I said in the previous lecture, action is just a pure JavaScript object. So let me just first create here a command and say here action. To create an action, we start with a constant keyword, or you can start with the let or var keyword as well. If you don't want to change the value of this object, you can use constant here. So I'm going to start with a constant and then specify the action name. I'm going to say here add to do action. You can specify any name to this action. That's upon you. This is just a variable name. And I'm going to specify equal to sign and then pass an object here, a simple JavaScript object. Inside this object, you have two keys. First is a type and second is a payload. Using this first key, we specify what type of action is this. I want to create a new post. So I'm going to just say here inside this type, create. This is always a best practice to put your action in a capital letters. So when you call this action in the reducer, the action will not mismatch. So we put the action in a capital letters. So this is the type of create action. Just out of that, as I said, inside a payload, we pass the data that we want to update in the store. So for example, inside this payload, if I say a new post for Redux. So when I call this action, React will update the state with this payload. You can notice how easy it is to create an action in Redux application. We just created a simple object with two keys. Now you might have multiple types or multiple actions inside this object. That's upon you. Now let's see how to create a reducer. To create a reducer, I'm going to first create here a command and say reducer. Creating reducer in Redux is super easy. Reducer is a pure JavaScript function. To create a reducer, I'm going to start with a constant keyword and then say here reducer. You can specify any name to this constant keyword. Just for understanding, I specify here reducer. And then I'm going to pass here a pure function. So I'm going to pass here an arrow function like this. To this parenthesis, I'm going to pass two parameters. First is a state and second is an action. State parameter is the initial value of the store. An action helps us to update the initial state value. Without an action, you can't update the store. And this store is going to return a simple state. So this is a simple syntax of reducer. Now the reducer first parameter is the initial state of your store. So when we create a reducer, we pass the initial state to this parameter. For example, if I just create here a variable, constant initial state is equal to, and inside this object, I'm going to say here post and pass an array here. So I'm going to just create here a simple initial state and pass post key to it. And the value is empty array. I'm going to pass this initial state to this parameter. So I'm going to just specify here equal to sign and then specify here initial state like this. So this is the default value of this state parameter. Now just out of that, we have here a second parameter called action. Using this action, we return the updated state. For example, here inside this reducer, I'm going to add here an action. I'm going to say here if inside this parenthesis, inside a condition, I'm going to say action dot type. If it is equal to create, then I'm going to return state plus 1. I'm going to just update this state value by 1. Now keep in mind, this is just a syntax of reducer. I'm not updating this initial value because as you can see here inside this initial value I have post, and I'm updating this state directly without accessing this post key. This is just a syntax. We use action parameter to check the action using if or switch statement, and then in the action we return the updated state. That's the simple use of reducer. And then once we have the reducer, we pass this reducer to the store. So just down here I'm going to create a store. So I'm going to add here a comment and say store. To create a store, I'm going to say here constant store is equal to, and I'm going to call here a function called create store. As you know, we don't have this function inside this file. Let me just import it at the top. Here I'm going to say import, in the curly braces I'm going to say create store from, in the single quote I'm going to say Redux. From the Redux package I'm going to get this create store function. We need to pass here curly braces because create store is not a default export. So I'm going to say here create store. So I can easily access this create store function, and as a parameter you can see you need to pass here reducer. So I'm going to say here reducer like this. So this will just simply create a store in Redux, and at the end you need to just export this store. So this statement is simply going to create a store using the reducer. Now this is the syntax of action, reducer and a store. Next we're going to create a simple example of Redux and see how to work with store, reducer and action together. Now in this lecture we're going to take a simple example of Redux and understand how to work with it. So let me just create a simple file inside this Redux folder. Here I'm going to create a new file and I'm creating a counter example. So I'm going to name this component counter.js. To understand how Redux works, counter is the best example. So I'm going to simply create here a file counter.js, and inside it I'm going to create a class component. So I'm going to say here React class component. Don't worry, you can use Redux in the functional component as well. We'll look at that later in this course. So just for now, let's add this counter, and let me just add this counter inside my main component. So let me just copy this counter and let me just add that here. Instead of this multiple context, I'm going to say here counter, and I'm going to just specify here Redux counter. Let me just add here counter and save this file. Back to your counter, and inside this division tag, inside this JSX, here I'm going to simply add h2 heading tag and say counter. Just out of this h2, here I'm going to add a division tag again, and inside this div I'm going to add my button. I'm going to name this button minus, and inside this button I'm going to add on click event, and just out of that inside this curly braces I'm going to add the handler function of it. Just down here I'm going to add the value of the counter. So inside the spawn tag here I'm going to add the value of the counter. So I'm going to simply add here curly braces for now, and just down here I'm going to add a button again and then specify plus here to add a value in a counter. So I'm going to add here on click event and pass curly braces. Now this is a simple JSX, right? I'm going to add two buttons here with on click events, and I'm going to print the counter value inside this spawn tag. Now let me create a handler function for both these buttons. At the top here, before this render method, I'm going to create handler function. So I'm going to say here increment is equal to and pass an arrow function here. Just out of that, here I'm going to say console.log increment. I'm going to do the same. So I'm going to copy this function and specify here decrement like this. Let me copy this, paste it here to indicate this is the decrement method. Inside this on click, here I'm going to first call this dot decrement, this decrement handler function, and to this plus sign I'm going to call here this dot increment. Now just out of that, here inside this spawn I'm going to create a property called count. So I'm going to say here this dot props dot count. I'm going to create here a property count, and I'm going to specify value to this count using the Redux. Now let me save this file. Here you can notice I'm going to have here minus and plus button. When I click on it, I'm going to get increment and decrement console message. Now just out of that, let me first create a reducer. because reducer performs most of the work. So inside this Redux folder, I'm going to create a new file and name it reducer.js. And inside this reducer, I'm going to create a reducer function. To create a reducer function, as I said in the previous lecture, there is a syntax. So I'm going to start with the function keyword, then specify the name of the reducer. I'm going to say here reducer, and then I'm going to specify a parenthesis. Inside this parenthesis, you have two parameters, state and action. And inside this reducer, you return a state. For now, I'm going to leave it as it is, and let me first initialize this state. So at the top, here I'm going to create a constant variable and specify initial state is equal to, and here I'm going to create count key with the value 0. So this is the initial value of my count variable. I'm going to pass that to this state. So I'm going to say here equal to sign and say initial state. So this is the initial value of your state. So as I said in the previous lecture, as a first parameter, we pass the initial state of the store, and then as a second parameter, we are going to pass the action. The action we perform using button click, form submission, and so on. Just for that, inside this function, here I'm going to say if action.type is equal to, in the double quote, in the capital letters, I'm going to say increment. If it is equal to increment, then I'm going to execute this if statement. Otherwise, I'm going to add here else if again. Most of the time, you have multiple actions. Using if statement here is not sensible. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use here switch case statement. Instead of if statement, I'm going to get rid of this if, and here I'm going to call switch. I'm going to say here switch action.type, and inside this curly braces, I'm going to add my first case. Inside this first case, if the action is equal to increment, then I'm going to return my state. When we click on this button, we're going to pass value to this type property. Don't worry about that. Inside this type, we have the action type. We're going to pass that when we click on the button. For now, just out of this first case, I'm going to add my second case here, just down here. I'm going to add here case, and inside this double quote, I'm going to say decrement, and specify here colon, and specify here my second case. I'm going to return here state. Now you can notice here, I'm just returning the initial value of the state. What I want, when the action is equal to increment, I want to increase the state value by 1. So right now, as you can see here, inside this state, I have this count property. Let me just access it using .count. And I want to increase it by 1. I'm going to say here plus 1. So when the increment action happen, I want to increase the state by 1. The opposite of this, I'm going to minus 1 from the state when the decrease action happen. So here I'm going to say state dot count minus 1. Just for that, if nothing match, I'm going to return the default value using the default case. So I'm going to say here default return state. I'm going to return the initial value, this one. Now just for that, I'm going to use this function in my other files. So let me just add here export default. So I can use this function in my other files, because when we create a store, we need this function. Let me save this reducer and back to my index.js right here. Inside this index file, I'm going to create a new store. To create a store right here, I'm going to say import. In the curly braces, I'm going to call a function create store from Redux. As you know, I already have this package in my project. In the previous lecture, we installed this package. Using this create store, I'm going to create a new store inside this application. So just down here, before this render method, right here, I'm going to create a store. So I'm going to say here constant store is equal to create store. When you pass parentheses here, you can notice you will have to pass reducer here as a parameter. So as you know, we have this reducer here inside this reducer.js file. Let me just pass that. So just down here, I'm going to say import reducer from, in the single quote, dot
/ in the Redux file I have reducer. Let me just use this function reducer inside my main file and pass this reducer as a parameter to this create store. Create store need reducer as a first parameter. Now just after that, as you know, in the context API we created a wrapper for the app to pass value to the store. We are going to do the same in the Redux. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simply add here a provider. So I'm going to say here import. In the curly braces, I'm going to say provider is equal to provider from, and in the single quote, I'm going to say Redux, React, Redux. As you know, using npm command, we already installed this package in this project. So I'm not going to install it again. So using this provider component, I'm going to wrap this counter. So instead of this browser router, I'm going to pass this provider here like this. And just out of that, I'm going to pass here store like this. I'm going to create a wrapper to this counter using this provider component, and this provider component have a property store, and to this store property we pass our Redux store, this one. Now let me save this file, and now what I want, when I click on this button, to this decrease button, I want to decrease the counter value by 1, and when I click on this increase button, I want to add 1 inside my state. To do that, as you can see here, I have here the handler function. Inside this handler function, I'm going to call here a dispatch method. For now, let me just print this keyword. Back to the browser, reload it. Let me just click on this counter. You can notice here I have different properties to this counter component. You can notice here I have context, decrement and increment handler function, property, reference and state. I want to first connect this component to the store, to the Redux store, so I can access the store value. To do that, you need to call a connect function from the React Redux. So I'm going to just add here the import statement. I'm going to say here import, in the curly braces, I'm going to say connect from, in the single quote, I'm going to say React Redux like this. And just after that, at the bottom here, I'm going to simply say export default connect. I'm going to pass here parentheses, and then I'm going to pass here parentheses again, because this is the higher order component. Connect is a higher order function, which is a fancy way of saying it's return a function when you call it. It's provide the connected component with a piece of data it needs from the store. Otherwise, I will get an error message. Let me save this file, reload the browser, and click on this add button. When I click on it, you can notice here inside this props, I have here a method called dispatch. Using this dispatch method, you can change the value of the store. Redux is going to change the store value only when you call the dispatch method. Dispatch method is going to take an action as a parameter. Let me use it to update the store value. So inside this handler function here, let me just comment this, and here I'm going to say this dot props. As you can see, I have these props here. So just out of these props, I'm going to say dot dispatch, and I'm going to call here parentheses. And inside this parentheses, we need to pass an action. So here I'm going to just pass here a simple object, because as I said, action is a simple JavaScript object. So I'm going to say here object and say type, and it is a type of increment. I'm going to just copy this increment value, this first case, and pass that here. So I'm going to pass here value to this type increment. So when I call this increment, this will call this dispatch method, and this dispatch method is going to execute this first case, because inside this action I'm going to have this increment type. So this will just initialize this action with the type increment when I click on this increment handler function. Now just after that, I'm going to do the same for this decrement as well. Let me copy it and specify that here, and this time I'm not going to specify increment, I'm going to specify here decrement. When I click on this decrement function, I'm going to execute this decrement action. Let me save this file, reload the browser. When I click on this button, it will increase and decrease the value of the state, but I'm not going to get any value inside this property, because I'm going to have this state value inside this reducer. I want to get this count value inside my counter component. So just out of this component here, I'm going to simply call function map state to props, and I'm going to pass here parentheses. This function takes the first parameter, which is state, and using this state parameter we can connect the reducer state with the property of the component. So I'm going to say here return statement, and I'm going to return an object. As you can see here, I have here count property. Let me pass that here. I'm going to say here count, and as a value I'm going to pass this state dot count. Inside this state I'm going to have this reducer state value, right? So I'm going to get that value and pass that to this property, and just after that you need to pass this function to this connect. The map state to prop is used for selecting the part of data from the store that the connected component needs. A store is supposed to contain the entire state of your application. For large application, this could contain dozens of properties nested many layers deep. It allows you to decouple your component, an additional time which increases the modularity of your code and improves the application performance. So I'm going to just copy this map state to props and pass that as a first parameter to this connect, just like this. You don't need to pass value to this state property because the connect function will automatically pass the reducer state value to this function. Inside this handler function, let me uncomment this console, and when I click on this plus button, you can notice here, just down here inside my props, I have here count property, which is right now undefined. When I click on this button, I want to specify value to this count property. So this function is going to create a property count and specify Redux value to it. Let me just first print this state. I'm using console.log. Here I'm going to say state, back to the component and reload it. As you can see, I'm going to have here count 0. When I click on this plus button, you can notice this will just return 1. I want the result something like this, count 0. So I can change my state value. To do that, inside my reducer, as you can see here, I'm just returning a simple value. So instead of returning just a simple value, I'm going to change the initial state of the count. So here I'm going to call object, and inside it I'm going to say count, and to the value I'm going to say here state count plus 1. I'm going to do the same. So I'm going to copy this statement, paste it here, and minus 1. Decrease the value when the action is equal to decrease. Save this file. Now when I click on the plus button, you can see it will return count 1. When I click on the plus button again, it will return count 2. So I'm going to have what I want. And you can notice here inside my component, when I click on the plus button, it's going to increase the value of the counter. And when I click on the minus button, it's going to minus the value of the counter. Let me remove this console message from here. Now, as you can see, my counter is completely ready. So as you can see how to create a simple counter example of Redux. Next, we're going to simplify this example and see how to work with action. Now, in this lecture, we're going to understand how to work with action in the Redux and simplify this counter example. I'm going to use my previous example and show you how you can simplify it. And also, we are going to create a simple action and understand how action reducer and store work together. So let's take a look at how to create an action first. So as you can see, I have here counter.js file, which we created in the previous lecture, and here I have a reducer. So just out of that, I'm going to create here an action. So inside this Redux folder, right here, I'm going to create a new file and name this file action.js. Here I'm going to create my action. So I'm going to create here a comment and say Redux action. As I said, action is nothing but a simple JavaScript object. Let me create an object here. I'm going to say here constant increment is equal to and pass an object here, and inside it I have a type which is increment and a payload, and here I'm going to pass value 1. So this is the type of increment action, and I'm going to pass a value 1 with this increment action. As you know, using payload, we are going to change the state of the store. We can pass value to the store using payload property, and using type we are going to specify the action. So this is the type of increment action. Now creating action like this will not allow you to pass value to the payload, because here you can notice I'm going to just specify hard-coded value here to the payload. What if I want to pass this value from the counter component? I need to call this object and then initialize this payload property. This is not the best way to do it. Let me show you a better way to create an action. Instead of this object, I'm going to create action creator, so I can pass value to this payload. So just on here, I'm going to say constant increment is equal to, and pass a function here, an arrow function like this. And I'm going to simply return an object, and inside this object I'm going to pass both this value. Right now you can notice I have here hard-coded value. So instead of this hard-coded value, I can just simply pass a value parameter and pass that here. So when I call this increment, I can pass value to this payload. Let me just comment this statement, and just down here I'm going to copy this function and paste it here. And instead of increment, I'm going to say decrement. And just out of that, here the type is equal to decrement, like this. This is the increment action and this is the decrement action. And just down here, because we are using both these functions outside of this file, I'm going to export it. So just down here I'm going to say export. Instead of default, I'm going to specify here curly braces and say here increment comma decrement. So I can access both these functions outside of this file. Let me save this file and back to my reducer. Inside this reducer, as I said, when you click on the button, it will initialize this action property. For now, let me just specify here console.log and let me see what we have inside this action parameter. Save this file. Redux will pass a random value inside this type. But when you click on the button, you can notice this will just initialize your action with the type increment. Let me explain what is going on here. When you click on the increment button, React is going to call this increment handler function, because as you know, we have this handler function to this button. When React will call this increment function, inside that function, I have a method called dispatch. Dispatch is a Redux method. Using this dispatch method, we are going to dispatch, or you can say trigger, an action. You can notice as a parameter, we pass here increment action. So I'm going to just initialize this reducer action parameter using this statement. So I'm going to pass here parameter type increment and initialize this action parameter. So when I click on the increment button, inside this type I have increment, and this will just execute this first case. Now just out of that, you can notice here I just specify here +1 and -1 inside this reducer. This is the hard-coded value, right? What if you want to pass these values from the component? Instead of passing these values here, I'm going to pass these values from the component. So what I'm going to do is, inside this counter, I'm going to pass here comma and pass another key, which is payload. And I'm going to pass value to it 1. Save this file for now and back to the reducer. Save this file. When I click on the plus button, you can notice here, I'm going to have type increment and payload 1. So now when I click on the plus button, it will initialize this action property with type increment and payload 1. So when I have my payload property with this action, I can pass that payload inside this case. So instead of this 1, I can just simply say here action dot payload, like this. Reload the browser, and when I click on this plus button, you can see my app is working fine. What if I want to increase the value by 5? So here inside my component, I'm going to simply pass here 5. Let me save the changes, back to the browser and reload it. When I click on this plus button, it will increase the counter value by 5. That's easy, right? Just out of that, let me back to the reducer, get rid of this console, and just copy this action payload to this decrease action, like this. Save this file and back to the counter. And inside this counter, to this decrement, I'm going to pass here comma and say payload 1. I'm going to decrease the counter value by 1. Let me change this 5 to 1. Now let me save the changes. I reload the browser and click on these buttons. My app, oops, I think I misspelled here. Payload, save this file, and when I click on this button, my app will work fine. Just out of that, as you can notice here, I'm creating my action inside these parameters instead of using this action file. So I'm going to use this function and pass that inside this counter. So just down here, I'm going to say import. Inside the curly braces, I'm going to say increment and decrement, like this. I'm going to import these functions from action. And just out of that, inside this increment, I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to simply print my increment function. I'm going to pass here increment and pass parenthesis to it. And as you know, to this parenthesis, I have a parameter called value. So when I call this function, I need to pass value to it. So inside this counter, if I say here 4, let me save this file. And when I click on this plus button, you can notice the increment function is going to return the type increment and payload 4. So now it's going to return an object with the type of action and a payload value. I'm going to just simply use this function and pass that to this parameter like this. And I want to increase the counter value by 1. So I'm going to specify here 1. Let me get rid of this statement. And I'm going to just call this decrement function and pass that here just like this. And I'm going to decrease the value of the counter by 1. So I'm going to say here 1. Save this file. And when I click on this plus and minus, you can notice my app will work completely fine. So this is how you can create an action in the Redux. So I hope you understand how to simplify your example of counter using action. Now, in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the different methods of the Redux store. We will look at how to work with these store methods in the Redux application. As you know, when you create a store, we pass reducer as a parameter. So the store can call a listener for the action. Store has its own methods. With Redux store, you will get 4 methods: getState, dispatch, subscribe, and replace reducer. So let's take a look at these methods one by one. So let's start with the first one, which is getState. So let me first back to my previous example. And here you can notice I have 3 files here: counter, action, and reducer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to back to my index file, and instead of creating my store inside this index file, I'm going to create that in a dedicated file. So inside my Redux folder right here, I'm going to create a new file and name this file store.js. And inside this file, I'm going to create my store. So I'm going to simply first import create store from Redux. Down here, I'm going to say constant store is equal to create store and pass reducer here. As you know, I don't have reducer inside this store. Let me import it. So I'm going to copy import reducer from Redux reducer. So I'm going to just import reducer here. So at the top, I'm going to say import reducer from specify single quote dot / and then specify here reducer file. Just out of that, I'm going to just pass this reducer to this create store like this. And at the end, don't forget to export this store as a default export, just like this. So I can use this store in my index file. Save this file back to the index, get rid of this create store and this statement. I can just simply say here import store from, in the single quote, I'm going to specify Redux and the store file like this. So now I can use this store in my index file. Save this file. You can notice the example will work fine. So you can notice in the Redux application, I'm going to separate the store, action, and reducer. This is always the best practice to create a dedicated file for the store, action, and reducer. So once I've done that, I'm going to just back to my counter. And now let's talk about the methods of the store. So inside my counter, I'm going to first import my store. So here I'm going to say import store from, in the single quote / I'm going to just call my store like this. Just after this import statement, here I'm going to say console.log and print in the double quote initial state. And then I'm going to pass here comma and then say here store dot get state like this. Back to your component, and as you can notice here, I'm going to have the initial state of my component. Right now I have the initial state 3. So the get state method is going to return the current state tree of the application. It is equal to the last value returned by the store reducer. So whenever you want to get the current value of your reducer, or you can say of your store, you can just call the store dot get state. If you want to get the current state, you can use this get state method. Just for that, we have dispatch method. As you know, dispatch is an action. Dispatch method used to update the store. Dispatch method is going to take an action as a parameter and update the store value. We already know that how to work with dispatch in the previous lecture. Just out of that, we have subscribe method. So just down here, let me create that method. I'm going to say here store dot subscribe, and in the parenthesis, this method takes the function as an argument, or you can call it a callback function. So I'm going to pass here a callback function like this, and inside it I'm going to say console.log, and in the single quote I'm going to say state after dispatch, and then I'm going to specify here colon, comma, and say here store dot get state. Now if you want, you can create this function outside of this subscribe method as well. Just for this example, I just added here inline function, and now the initial state of this counter is 0. When I click on this plus button, you can notice I'm going to get here a console message state after dispatch. So whenever I call the dispatch method, the subscribe method will automatically call. This method is very interesting. With this method, you will get the listener as a parameter. You can notice here we have this listener as a parameter. Whenever the action is dispatched, we're going to get this method. This method will be called anytime an action is dispatched, and some part of the state tree may potentially have changed. You can notice here I didn't call this subscribe method, but when I click on this dispatch method, I'm going to get my subscribe method called. Now you can notice whenever I click on the increase or decrease, Redux will call this subscribe method. Redux will register this method and call whenever the action happens. Now what I want to unregister this method. To do that, we need to store this method in a variable. So I'm going to say here constant unregister is equal to, that's upon you, you can specify any name to this variable. This is just for unregistering this subscribe method. So what I'm going to do is inside this decrement right here, I'm going to say unregister, and I'm going to just call here parenthesis, because subscribe is going to return a function. So I'm going to pass here parenthesis. Let me save the changes and show you the result first. Let me reload the browser and click on this plus button. Whenever I click on this increment button, this action will call the subscribe method. But when I click on this decrease button, this will first call the subscribe method, and inside this decrement, you can notice here I have this unregister function. So after that, once you execute your unregister and try to click on this decrease again, this will not call the subscribe method again. Subscribe method is useful whenever you want to do something after the action happen. Whenever you execute the dispatch with an action, that will call the subscribe method. And to stop the subscribe method, or you can say to unregister the subscribe method, just pass this method to the variable and call it as a function. And just for that, at the end, we have replace reducer. Replace reducer is a method to replace the reducer currently used by the store to calculate the state. It is the advanced API. So before understanding this method, we need to know more about Redux. So we will look at this method later in this course. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn how to create a Redux store using a functional component. We're going to create a simple example of a Redux application and create that example using a functional React component. Using functional React component, it's super easy to create Redux store. You need to just use some React Redux hook. So let's take a look at how to create it. I'm going to create a new folder inside this Redux. Right here, I'm going to create a new folder and name it functional. So I'm going to say here fn example, or you can say fn redux. Inside this fn redux, I'm going to create a new file and name it example.js. So here inside this file, I'm going to create my functional component. So I'm going to say here React functional component, and I'm going to just import that inside my main index file. Right here, I'm going to just import that example like this. Get rid of this counter, specify here fn redux and example. Now here inside this example, inside the JSX, I'm going to create two buttons. So I'm going to say here button, and inside it, I'm going to say car, and I'm going to call here on click event like this. Just for that, just down here, I'm going to call h1 heading tag, and inside this, I'm going to simply print a variable. So I'm going to create here a variable counter vehicle like this. Just for that, I'm going to copy this button and paste it here again, because I'm going to create two buttons here. The second button I'm going to name is bike. Now what I want, when I click on this first button, I want to print it's a car, and when I click on the second button, I want to print it's a bike. That's it. That's a simple example we're going to create in this example, but with using functional React component. So just for that, here inside this FN Redux, I'm going to create a new file and name it action.js. As you know, in the Redux you need action. Let me close all these files and back to my action.js, and here I'm going to create my action. As you know, we can create an action using a simple object, or we can create a simple action creator. Now let me show you how to use object and create an action. So just down here I'm going to say constant action types is equal to, and in the curly braces I'm going to say car, and in the double quote I'm going to say car, and here I'm going to say bike, and in the double quote I'm going to say bike. So as I said, when I click on the first button, I want to call an action car, and when I click on the second button, I want to call an action bike. Just for that, inside this FN Redux, I'm going to create my reducer. So I'm going to create a new file for that and say reducer.js. So let's create a reducer. So just down here, I'm going to create a function with the name reducer. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this reducer function. And then we need to pass two parameters here, state and action. And just for that, I'm going to initialize the state with a default value. So instead of creating a new variable for that, I'm going to specify here equal to sign, and in this object, I'm going to specify vehicle and specify empty value to it. So I'm going to just specify empty value to this vehicle key. Just for that, inside this reducer, I'm going to call here switch statement. So I'm going to call here switch. Inside a parenthesis, I'm going to say action.type, then specify curly braces, and here I'm going to create my first case. As you can see here, I have here an action car. So I'm going to just use here car like this. So when the car action happen, I want to execute this first case, and inside this case I'm going to simply return an object with vehicle key, and the value is going to be it is a car. That's it. I'm going to do the same for the second case as well. So I'm going to copy this, paste it down here like this, and instead of car, here I'm going to say bike, and I'm going to just change this value as well with bike. Now as you can notice here, I just use here hard-coded value. Instead of using this hard-coded value, I can use here action. So inside the reducer, I can just simply import action types from my action file like this, and then instead of this hard-coded value, I can just simply pass action types dot car, and here I can pass action type dot bike. So I'm going to just pass these values to this reducer case. Just for that, I'm going to say here export default reducer. Save this file and pass reducer as a parameter to the store. Instead of creating a new file for the store, I can use this same store, this one. I'm going to use this file store and use this same code, but instead of using this reducer, I'm going to use this example reducer. So instead of this reducer, I'm going to pass here fn redux and pass my reducer. I'm going to pass this reducer to this store. Save this file. As you know, I already have this store inside this index file right here, so I don't need to import it again. Just for that, open your example.js, and now inside this example.js file, I'm going to connect this component to my store. In the class component, we know that using connect function, we connected the component with the Redux store. You don't have to do it in a functional component. In the functional component, if you want to use the Redux store, you just need to add some hooks. So at the top, here I'm going to say import, and inside the curly braces, I'm going to pass some hooks from React Redux. So inside these curly braces, I'm going to simply say use selector. So I'm going to just call here hook use selector, and just down here inside my example, I'm going to say here use selector, and as a parameter, I'm going to pass here a callback function. So I can access the reducer state. So this hook is going to return the reducer value when you pass a callback function to it. So inside this parenthesis, I'm going to pass here state and pass an arrow here like this, and I'm going to return state. So this function is going to get the current state from the reducer and pass that to the variable and return it. So let me just get that return value inside a variable. I'm going to say here constant counter is equal to. So I'm going to get the current reducer value inside this counter variable. You can notice here I already have this counter variable inside this h1 heading tag. Use selector allows you to extract the data from the Redux store. Use selector will also subscribe to the Redux store and run your selector whenever the action is dispatched. This hook takes the state parameter, and using it you can access the state of the current store. So you can notice here we pass here parameter state and return that parameter. So I can access the reducer state. So once I have my reducer state, I'm going to just call vehicle property of it. You can notice here we just initialize this vehicle property here in this initial value of the reducer. I'm going to use that here, and just out of this use selector, I'm going to use another hook called use dispatch, and just out of that here I'm going to say constant dispatch is equal to use dispatch and then pass here parenthesis. That's it. And I'm going to use this dispatch method to dispatch an action. Dispatch is a hook, refers to the dispatch function from the Redux store. In the previous lecture, we understand how to use dispatch method with a class component. It's just like you call the dispatch method in the class component, but with a functional reference. Here we just call the same dispatch method reference, and we call that reference inside this dispatch variable. Let me just call this dispatch inside this onClick event. When I click on this button, I want to dispatch an event. So inside this onClick, I'm going to call here a function, a callback function like this, and inside it I'm going to say dispatch and call parenthesis to it. As you know, to this dispatch we need to pass an action as a parameter. So inside this parenthesis here I'm going to pass an object and say here type, and I'm going to call here an action of the type car. So I'm going to copy this action and pass that here. So when I click on this button, I'm going to execute the car type action. And just after that, here inside this bike, inside this onClick event, I'm going to call the callback function and call dispatch method again. And as a parameter, here I'm going to pass here an object and call action type. So I'm going to say here type, and this will type of bike action. So I'm going to pass here bike. Now just out of that, let me show you what we have inside this counter variable. So let me print it down here, console.log counter. Save this file, save all your files. Now when you reload your browser, you will get an error message. Cannot create a property vehicle of undefined. I'm going to get this message because I don't have any value inside this vehicle variable. Because inside the reducer, you can notice I just added here two cases. What about the default case? I need to pass the default value to this vehicle when both these cases failed. So just down here, don't forget to add default, and inside it I'm going to return vehicle nothing. Back to your browser, you can notice I'm going to get the default value here inside this state. Now let me show you what happened when I click on this button. When I click on the car, I'm going to get it's a car, and when I click on this bike button, I'm going to get it's a bike. So that's simple, right? I'm going to get all that messages inside the console as well. So inside this counter, I'm going to get all the values of the current state. So the use selector is going to return the current state of the store, and we are going to use dispatch hook to dispatch an action. So I hope you understand this simple example using the use selector and use dispatch hook. So I hope you understand how to work with use selector and use dispatch hook in the functional React component. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn what is combined reducer of Redux. We're going to understand how to use combined reducer helper function of the Redux in the React application. So let's see what is combined reducer function is. The combined reducer helper function turns an object those values are different reducing functions into a single reducing function you can pass to create store. as your app grows more complex, you'll want to split your reducing functions into separate functions, each managing independent parts of your state. In the combined reducer function, you pass the different reducers. The resulting reducer call every child reducer and gather their result into a single state object. The state produced by the combined reducer function namespace, the state of each reducer under their keys as passed to the combined reducers. Let me explain what this means. Just take a look at this combined reducer method. Here I'm going to create a root reducer and I'm going to pass combined reducer helper function to it. And inside a parenthesis, I'm going to pass two reducer functions here. First is a to-do reducer and second is a counter reducer. I'm going to pass both this reducer function as an object. So the combined reducer function will grab both this reducer function and create a single state object. This statement will produce a single state object just like this. And inside both this object, we have different properties. You can use ES6 property shorthand notation as well to create this. For example, if you use combined reducer and if you pass counter and to-dos like this, then this is equivalent. Now let me create a very simple example to show you how you can use combined reducer in the Redux application. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to simply create a new folder for this example. So inside this Redux, right here I'm going to create a new folder and name it combined reducer example. So I'm going to say CR example. Inside this combined reducer example, I'm going to create a new file for the example and I'm going to name it combine.js. Just for that, let me create here a functional component, React functional component, and let me import this file in my index. So I'm going to back to my index file right here, get rid of this path, and right now I'm going to import combined reducer example combine file. Let me get rid of, let me copy my combine. Here I'm going to paste my combine component like this. I'm going to leave the store as it is because I'm not going to create a new file for the store. Instead, I'm going to use this store file for that. So inside this combined reducer example, I'm going to create another file for the reducer. So I'm going to say here reducer.js. So what I'm going to do is, inside my combine, here I'm going to create three buttons. I'm going to use my first button to add the to-do list. Second button is used for increment and third button is used for decrement. So here I'm going to create h1 heading tag and say combine reducers. Just down here I'm going to create a button and name this button add to-dos. Just down here I'm going to duplicate this button, change this text, and here I'm going to say increment and this became decrement. As well as don't forget to add on click event to all these buttons like this. So I'm going to add here on click event to all these buttons. Just for that, I'm going to back to my reducer and here I'm going to create two different reducers. First for the to-dos and second for the counter. So to create a reducer, as you know, we start with a function keyword and specify the reducer name. I'm going to say here to-dos. Inside the reducer, we have two parameters, state and action. I'm going to initialize the state with an empty array. So I'm going to specify here equal to sign and specify here an empty array. Just for that, inside this, I'm going to add here switch statement, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to say action.type, and in the curly braces, I'm going to create my first case. Inside my first case, in this double quote, I'm going to say add to do. Just for that, inside this first case, I'm going to return state dot concat, and then I'm going to concat the value with action payload. So inside this array right here, I'm going to add my to do. So I'm going to pass that array here, and inside it I'm going to say action dot payload. I'm going to get the value from the component. Just for that, just down here I'm going to add here default, and I'm going to return state, the initial state of this reducer. So this is my first to do reducer. Just down here I'm going to create my second reducer. So I'm going to say here function counter, pass your state and action parameter. To this state I'm going to specify initial value which is 0. Just down here I'm going to say switch. In the parenthesis I'm going to say action dot type, and inside it I'm going to create my first case. So I'm going to say here case increment, and in the first case I'm going to say return state plus 1. In the second case, in the single quote decrement And if the action is equal to decrement, I'm going to return state minus 1. Don't forget to add here default case. So I'm going to say here default and return a simple state, just like this. So as you can see here, we have two reducers. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this reducer to my store. Let me save this file and back to my store.js file. Right here, I'm going to add my reducer. So I'm going to first add my file here. So here I'm going to say ./CR example and add here reducer file. From this reducer file, I'm going to export this to do and this counter. So let me just add here export statement, export to do's and export counter. Save this file, back to the store, and as you know, we can access both these functions inside a curly braces. I'm going to pass here curly braces, say here to do's and counter, like this. Just like that, you don't need to pass both these functions to this parameter. Instead, you need to create here a variable. So I'm going to say here constant reducer is equal to, and here you need to call combine reducer function. You can notice here when I call this combine reducer, this will automatically import in this curly braces. So when you want to use combine reducer, you need to first import it using Redux module. So once you import that, inside this parenthesis, just pass an object, pass here my first reducer to do's and the second reducer, which is counter, like this. Just down here inside this store, I'm going to pass this reducer, this one, just like this. Now let me save this file and back to my combine.js file. Inside this file, let me first import some Redux hooks. We already know that how to import the Redux hooks. So I'm going to say here curly braces and I'm going to specify hooks from React Redux. And I'm going to import use selector and use dispatch hooks. I'm going to use both these hooks inside this example. So I'm going to first import that and just out of this combine right here inside this function, I'm going to say constant counter is equal to, you can specify any name to this variable, that doesn't matter, and specify here use selector, and in the parenthesis, as you know, this will return a state. So I'm going to say here state, specify an arrow and return a simple state. We all know how to use this use selector. We already learned that in the previous lecture. Just like that, I'm going to say here constant dispatch is equal to, and then specify here use dispatch hook, like this. Let me just console this counter so you'll understand what is happening. Just down here, don't forget to call a dispatch method. So when I click on the button, I'm going to change the store. So inside this on click, in the first on click right here, I'm going to call an arrow function and specify here dispatch, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to pass my action. The action is a type of add to do, and as you know, we're going to get the values from the user. You can notice here we have the payload property as well. Let me pass that here. So I'm going to say here payload, and inside the payload I'm going to pass add to do's. I'm going to add another dispatch method. So I'm going to say here arrow, call the dispatch method like this and pass my action type. So I'm going to say here type, and it is the type of increment. So I'm going to say here increment, and just down here I'm going to add another arrow function with the dispatch method, and in the parentheses I'm going to specify type, and it is a type of decrement, like this. Now I'm going to save this file. You can notice here when I reload the browser, I'm going to have here combine reducer title, and I'm going to get here three buttons: add to do's, increment and decrement. You know that I have two reducer for this example. You can notice here the initial state of this counter is something look like this. I have the to do key and I'm going to initialize it with empty array, and then I'm going to have counter with the initial value of 0. When I click on this add to do's, this will just initialize this array, and inside this array I have add to do's, and the counter is still 0 because I did not dispatch any event of the counter reducer. When I click on the increment, this will call the counter reducer and you will have the one value inside your counter. Let me click on the increment again. This will increase the value of the counter by 1, and I'm going to have to do as it is. Let me click on the decrement. This will decrease the value of the counter by 1, and when I click on the add to do again, this is going to add the to do inside this array. You can notice here. So basically, the combine reducer is going to combine two reducer and create a single object. I have to-dos reducer and a counter reducer. Both are working together using combine reducer helper function. Practice with this example to understand how to work with combine reducer. Next, we're going to see how to use apply middleware helper function. Now, in this lecture, we're going to understand how to work with apply middleware helper function in the Redux. We're going to see the different features of using helper functions, and we will see how to use these apply middleware helper function in the React application. One of the more interesting concepts in Redux is to include the custom middleware functions to the dispatch method of your store. So what is a middleware function is? Redux middleware functions provide a medium to interact with dispatch action before they reach to the reducer. Each middleware receives the store dispatch so that they can dispatch a new action, so that they can access the current state and return a function. The common use case for middleware is to support asynchronous actions. Isn't it interesting? It is. So let's see how to work with middleware functions in the Redux application. So let me just back to my previous example and then show you how you can work with middleware functions. So I'm going to back to my store.js file, and inside this file, I'm going to create my middleware. That's upon you. You can create a dedicated file for that as well. Just for now, I'm going to create a new function for the reducer. So just after this reducer, right here, I'm going to create a new function. So I'm going to say here constant. I'm going to name this middleware log middleware. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this middleware. This is just a function. When you create a middleware, you're nesting a functions. You're creating a function inside another functions. So to create a middleware, you need to start with a function. I'm going to use here arrow function just like this. And this function is going to take first argument, which is store. This function nests another function, or you can say inside this function, we have another function. So I'm going to call here parentheses and the arrow again like this. So inside this function, I have this function. This is what we call a function nesting. Inside this parenthesis, we can get the next parameter. Inside this second function, I have another function by specifying parentheses and an arrow, just like this. Now you can notice here I have three functions. Inside the first function, we have the store parameter. Inside the second function, we have next parameter. And inside this third function, we have the action parameter. Now this is the syntax of the middleware. Now let me show you what we have inside these parameters. So just down here, inside this middleware function, I'm going to simply say console.log, and inside it, I'm going to print previous state. And I'm going to just specify here comma, call the store dot get state. As you know, we have get state method to the store object. So I'm going to just access that, specify here colon, and just down here, I'm going to pass next and pass here action parameter. Now, just for that, what you need to do is you need to pass this middleware function as a second argument to this create store. Instead of just passing this function, you need to call here another helper function, which is apply middleware. So I'm going to say here constant middleware called. I'm going to create here a constant variable. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this variable. Here I'm going to call a method called apply middleware like this. Now when I add this method, you can notice VS Code will automatically import that method in this curly braces. So when you want to use this method, you need to first import that. Once you import that using the Redux module, you need to just pass here parentheses and pass your middleware here. I'm going to pass here log middleware like this. So now once you apply your middleware function, just call this variable as a second argument to this create store function, just like this. Now save this file and try to execute it. Now you can notice when I reload the browser, I'm going to get my previous example console message. Let me just remove this message right from here. Save this file, reload the browser. And now when you click on any of these buttons, when you dispatch your action, middleware will automatically call. So when I click on this add to dos, middleware will automatically call, and you can notice here I'm going to get my previous state here. When I click on this increment, you can notice here this will return my previous state. Using just a simple get state, I'm going to get the previous value of my store. Now what is the meaning of this next action? Calling next continues propagation of the current action. It's important to not alter the action and call it once and only once within a middleware. That is why we pass here next and pass action to it. What if I call this console after this next function like this. Let me show you what happens if I do it. Reload the browser and click on these to-dos. You can notice right now I'm not going to get my previous state. Instead, this is my current state. So when you access your state after this next function, you will get your current state, and before this next function, you will get your previous state. Just take that in your account. Let me show you what we have inside this action. Get rid of this complete statement and specify here action. Reload the browser and click on this to-dos. You can notice this will simply print my action. The type of action is add to do, and I'm going to have here payload add to-dos. Using the store parameter, we can get the current store value. Using the next, we're going to get the previous and the next value of the store. Using this next function, we can access the previous and the current state value. The another use of this next function is to pass this middleware action to the next middleware. For example, let's say you have multiple middlewares in your Redux application. This next function is going to pass this action to your next middleware function, and you can pass all your middleware functions to this apply middleware function. You are not limited to only pass one or two middleware functions to this apply middleware. Now this is the simple syntax of this middleware. Now the next question comes in, when to use this middleware function. Adding middleware gives us a place to intercept action and run a side effect before or after an action occurs. Now let me show you the execution of the Redux store. When you click on the button, it will first capture the event and then dispatch the action. Once the action is dispatched, Redux will call this middleware. After that, once the middleware is executed, just after this middleware, Redux will call this reducer. Reducer creates a new state from the change prescribed by the action and then update the store. And after that, the new state is passed to the React application using properties. Now, I hope you understand how to create a syntax of the middleware in the Redux application. Don't worry, I'm going to create a simple application in the Redux and show you how you can use the middleware inside it. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn how to use the bind action creator helper function in the Redux application. Normally, we should just call a dispatch directly on our store instance. If you use Redux with React, React Redux will provide you with a dispatch function so you can call it directly too. The only use case for binding action creator is when you want to pass some action creators down to a component that isn't aware of Redux. Let me show you how to use this bind action creator helper function in the Redux application. I'm going to use my previous example to understand how this helper function works. So I'm going to use this reducer and this combine file. But before that, I'm going to create my action file. So I'm going to create a new file here and say here action.js. Inside this file, I'm going to create my action. So I'm going to say here export function add to do. I'm going to create action creator here like this. And I'm going to pass here parameter text. Just out of that, this action creator is going to return an object, and I'm going to specify action type, which is add to do. And then here I'm going to pass text. Just out of that, let me copy this function and paste it here. And I'm going to change this function to remove to do. Inside this text, I'm going to specify ID, and I'm going to change this type as well. I'm going to say here remove to do, and I'm going to change this text to ID, just like this. Just out of that, I'm going to back to my reducer. Inside my reducer, I have here a to-dos function. Inside this to-dos function, I'm going to have here a case add to do. You can notice here inside my action, I have my first action add to do. What you need to do is you need to create a remove to do inside your reducer right here. You need to create a second case of remove to do. That is the exercise for you. I'm going to leave this as it is and back to my combine.js file. Inside this file, let me just get rid of this functional component, and now I'm going to create here a class component. So here I'm going to say React class component, and then I'm going to get rid of this import statement. Just out of that, let me just export this combine using the connector. So let me first connect this class to the store. Let me get rid of the export statement, and just down here I'm going to say export default, and then I'm going to specify connect. Inside this second parenthesis, I'm going to specify my component. So I'm going to say here combine like this. So once I connect my class, I can access the dispatch method
using this class. So inside this class, I'm going to create a constructor like this with super method, and I'm going to pass here props. Just down here inside this constructor, I'm going to get the dispatch function. So I'm going to say here constant using curly braces. I'm going to say here dispatch is equal to props. So this will just get the dispatch method from this combined component. Just down here, I'm going to call the component lifecycle hook, which is component date mount. I'm going to just call this dispatch method inside it like this. This time I need to pass here this, because without this keyword I can't access the properties of this component. And now just for that, I'm going to use bind action creator function. So at the top, let me first import that function. So I'm going to say here import in the curly braces. I'm going to say from Redux, and from this Redux module I'm going to import bind action creator. Just out of that, I need my actions as well. So I'm going to say here import star as to do action creator, and I'm going to say here from, in the single quote I'm going to specify my action file like this. So from my action, I'm going to import all my export functions and store that in this object, so I can access all my functions one by one using this object. Just for that, inside this constructor here, I'm going to set this dot bound action creator is equal to, and then I'm going to call here bind action creator helper function, and inside this parenthesis you need to pass your action and the dispatch method. As you know, we have the action here, this one, to do action creator. I'm going to pass that here. So I'm going to say here to do action creator like this, and as a second argument you need to pass dispatch method. So as you can see here, I have here a dispatch method. Let me just pass that here, dispatch. Now using this statement, I just bind the action with the dispatch method. Now just for that, let me just print, I'm going to say here console.log bound action creator like this. Just down here inside this component did mount, here I can just simply say let action is equal to do action creators dot add to do, and I'm going to just pass here a text called use Redux. I'm going to pass value to this text parameter. Just for that, once I have my action, I'm going to pass that to the dispatch method. So I'm going to say here dispatch, and inside the parenthesis I'm going to say here action, just like this. That's it. And now just down here, let me just print to do's. So I'm going to say here let, in the curly braces I'm going to say to do's this dot props. So from my component props, I'm going to get the to do's property. Right now I don't have this property because I did not specify any function inside this connect. We need to first get the reducer state and then specify that state to the component property. To do that, in the previous lectures we created a function called map state to props. I'm going to do the same here, but instead of creating a new function, I'm going to create an inline function here. So inside this parenthesis, I'm going to first create a parameter state, specify an arrow, and inside this parenthesis I'm going to create a property to do's and specify state dot to do's. So this will just create a property inside this component. Let me just print this to do's. Just down here I'm going to say console.log and print to do. Back to my component and reload it. As you can see, inside my component, this will first print my action creator. You can notice here inside my action creator I have add to do and remove to do. Just for that, it will print the empty array and then print the action type. Now let me just leave everything as it is. Let me specify here comment. Now this is the bind action creator function, and when the component is mounted, I'm going to get this add action event. Now let me remove this bound action creator and just print this keyword. And you can notice I have here a component. Inside it I have different properties, and inside these properties you can notice I have here bound action creators. This property is going to return two functions, add to do and remove to do. Along with that, inside properties you have your dispatch method, so you can dispatch any action. Now here, what if you want to create a component that is not aware of Redux and you don't want to pass a dispatch or Redux store to that component? In that case, you can pass this bound action creator property as well as your props to the child component. So the child component can access the dispatch and your Redux action.
For example, let's say you want to pass your action and the dispatch method to your child component. In that case, you just need to call your component. For example, let's say I have here a component called to-do list. And to this component, I'm going to simply pass dispatch property, and then I'm going to say here this dot props dot dispatch, just like this. So this will just pass this dispatch method to the child component, and just out of that you can just simply pass your curly braces and pass spread operator like this, and then here you can say this dot bound action creator. So now when you create your to-do list, you can access the dispatch method as well as your action creator. Now I hope you understand how to work with bound action creator helper function in Redux. Next, I'm going to show you how to work with Redux toolkit. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn how to work with Redux toolkit. Redux toolkit is a standard way to write the Redux application logic. Redux toolkit contains packages and functions that we can think are essential for building a Redux app. Redux toolkit, built in our suggested best practices, simplifies most Redux tasks, prevents common mistakes, and makes it easier to write Redux application. Redux toolkit makes it easier to write good Redux application and speed up development. The Redux toolkit was originally created to help address three common concerns: configuring a Redux store, save us from importing lots of packages to do anything useful, and the third concern is Redux requires too much boilerplate code. So Redux toolkit will solve these common problems. So let me just create a simple example to explain how you can use Redux toolkit in your React application. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to first open my terminal. Let me just stop my development server, clear the screen, and then I'm going to install the Redux toolkit. Redux toolkit is not built in, so you need to first install it in your React application. So I'm going to say here npm I for install, and then I'm going to say add redux.js /toolkit. Let me install this in my application. So I'm going to press enter. Now once I have this package, let me clear the screen, start the development server again. Let me close this, and now I'm going to create a new folder for this Redux toolkit. Inside this Redux, I'm going to create a new folder and name it toolkit. And inside this toolkit, I'm going to create a simple example to understand how to create a Redux toolkit. I'm going to first create a new file and name this file store.js. To create a store in Redux toolkit, you need to first import the Redux.js toolkit. So to do that, you need to first simply say here import statement, and in the curly braces, you need to just import the function called configure store from @Redux.js toolkit. So from this package, you need to import a function called configure store. And using the store, we're going to create the Redux store. So just down here, I'm going to say here export default, and then I'm going to say here configure store, and in the parentheses, I'm going to pass an object. And here, this configure store is going to take a reducer as a parameter. So I'm going to say here reducer, and here you need to pass your reducer in this object. For now, I'm going to leave this as it is, and inside the curly braces, you need to pass your reducer. I don't have my reducer, so let me create a new reducer. So let me save this file, close all these unwanted files from here, like this, and inside this toolkit, I'm going to create a new file and name it reducer.js. And just out of that, I'm going to create another file here inside this toolkit and name it counter.js. Inside this counter file, I'm going to create a simple example of counter. Instead of writing the same code again and again in every example, let me copy my previous code and specify that here. Now let me explain this component. I'm going to first create a counter function. Inside this function, I'm going to use the hook called useSelector and useDispatch. You all know how to work with both these hooks. Just out of that, inside this JSX, I'm going to create two buttons. First for the increment and second for the decrement. And inside this parenthesis, I'm going to call action. So as you can notice here, I'm going to call here reducer, and inside this reducer, I have these functions: this increment, this decrement, and this select count. When working with Redux and Redux toolkit, your component will be same, but the difference is your store and your reducer will be different. You can notice here inside the store, I use here configure store function to initialize my store, or you can say to create a store. Just out of that, let me back to the reducer and create a new reducer inside this application. To create a reducer, you need to call a function create slice from the Redux toolkit. So at the top, I'm going to say import from, and then I'm going to specify Redux toolkit. And from this package, you need to import create slice function. And using this function, I'm going to create a reducer. This function allows us to easily create a reducer for the Redux application. Let me show you how we can use this function. Just down here, I'm going to say export constant slice is equal to, and I'm going to call here create slice. And in the parenthesis, as an object, I'm going to pass different properties. Here, you need to first specify the name for this slice. So you need to call here a property called name. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this slice. I'm going to specify here counter. You may have multiple slices in your React application. So you need to uniquely identify all your slices. That is why you need to specify here name for your slice. Just out of that, here I'm going to create a reducer. So you have a property to this create slice, which is reducers. And to this reducer property, you need to pass an object. So to create a reducer inside this Redux toolkit, you need to first create here a key. I'm going to say here increment and then specify a function to it. So I'm going to say here function. I'm going to pass here arrow function just like this. And now just out of that, to this parenthesis, I'm going to pass state, the initial value of your store. You can notice here, I don't have any initial value to my store. I need to first specify it. So as you know, when we create a store, we need to pass state and action parameter. But when you work with Redux toolkit, you don't have state and action parameter. So to specify value to your Redux store, you can access a property called initial state, and you can specify value to it. So I'm going to simply pass here curly braces and say here value 0. So this is the initial value of my store. That's upon you. You can specify any value to this initial state. Just out of that, inside this increment, here I'm going to say state dot value, and I'm going to specify plus equal to sign and specify 1 here, because when I click on the button, I want to increase the state by 1. Just out of that, here I'm going to specify comma and create my second case. Inside my second case, I'm going to say decrement, and then I'm going to specify value to it. So I'm going to pass here a function, a callback function. So instead of parentheses, I can simply say here state, pass an arrow, and inside these curly braces, I can say state dot value minus equal to 1. So this will decrease 1 from the state. Your reducer is now successfully created. This is a combination of action creator and a reducer. This is the action creator, and inside it I have a reducer. So now once you specify your reducer, to this slice you have a property called actions, and to that actions you have all these actions. So to get that action, you can just simply call here constant. In the curly braces, you can say increment decrement is equal to slice dot actions. So from the actions parameter, you can access both these functions. And then if you want, you can export your action using export keyword. Just out of that, at the end, you need to export the reducer as well, this reducer object. So at the end, just down here, I'm going to say export default slice dot reducer. So now you can pass this reducer to your store. Let me save this file back to the store, and let me first import, and I'm going to specify here counter reducer from, in the single quote, I'm going to specify reducer. So once I have my reducer, I can pass that to this reducer object like this. So now your store is now successfully configured. Let me save this file back to the reducer, save this file as well, and back to your counter. Inside my counter component, I just imported the reducer file, and from this file I imported 3 functions: increment, decrement, and select count. We already created the increment and the decrement action. Let me create this function, and I'm going to show you what is the use of this function after a few seconds. Let me first create it, and just up here I'm going to say export count is equal to, and then I'm going to specify here state, and then I'm going to simply return a state. Let me first show you the result. I'm going to say here console.log, and I'm going to print here state. Save this file, back to your index.js, and let me just import counter here. Instead of this combine, I'm going to say here counter from Redux toolkit. From the toolkit, I need this counter component. Just for that, let me just import my store as well. Get rid of this, specify the toolkit and my store file. I'm going to get here counter reducer, and inside it I have here a value. Let me just access it. So here I'm going to say dot counter reducer. When I reload the browser, you can notice I'm going to have value 0. So here I'm going to say dot value. So I can easily access my state value using this function. So instead of this console.log, I'm going to simply return this state value. Save this file, back to the counter.js, save this file as well. When I reload the browser, you can notice I'm going to have here my counter. When I click on the plus button, it will increase the counter value. When I click on the decrease button, it will decrease the counter value. Now let me explain this component. Here I'm going to just import the actions, the increment and decrement, and pass that to the dispatch method. So I can easily call my actions. Just for that, I'm going to use a useSelector and call a state. And using this select count function, I'm going to create a property called value and specify a state to it, a reducer state. Using this function, I'm going to specify value to the property of the component. And then I'm going to access that property and specify that here inside my span tag. So whenever you use Redux toolkit, you just need to update your reducer and your store. Practice with this code to understand how it works. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn more about the connect function of the Redux. We all know how the connect function is useful to connect the React component with the Redux store. We all know that the connect function is going to connect the React component with the Redux store. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the connect function parameters. The connect function has two important parameters. First is a map state to props, and second is a map dispatch to props. Let's see how to use these functions to create a Redux application. I'm going to use my previous example to show you how you can use both these functions. So I'm going to open my Visual Studio Code editor, and inside this Redux folder, I have my previous files here: reducer, counter, action, and store. I'm going to open my counter.js file, and inside this file, you can notice here I have map state to props function. We already know how to create these functions in the previous lectures. Now let me explain what is the use of this function. You know that I'm going to use this function to create a property inside the component. I'm going to create a count property inside this counter component and specify the Redux value to it. This function is going to take a parameter called state. This state is going to return the current state of the store. If I try to print this component using constructor, if I create here a constructor like this with super props, and if I say here console.log, and if I print this component, then you can notice here inside this component, inside the properties, I have here a property called count. This function is going to create a count property in my component and specify state value to it. If I create here console.log, then I'm going to get that state in my console. This is my initial state of the store. So using this state parameter, you can access the state and specify your current state to your component property. So whenever you pass a new value to the state, it will change the property value of your component. You are not limited to only specify map state to props name to this function. Instead, you can pass any name to this function. This is just for reference. For example, if I remove this map from this function, and if I change this function into ES6 like this, if I remove this function, specify here constant state to props is equal to, remove this parenthesis and add here an arrow. Now this is the type of ES6 function. Now this is also a valid function in Redux. Let me just pause this function here like this. As you can see, your example will work fine. So using this function, you can get the reducer value and pass that to your component property. So this is the first parameter of this connect function. Now let's talk about the second parameter of this connect function. To this second parameter, you can pass a function called map dispatch to prop functions. Map dispatch to props function is the second parameter to the connect function, and this function either be an object or a function or not supplied. If you don't want to supply this function as a second parameter to this connect, that's completely fine, because in your component you can access the dispatch method. When you use connect function to connect your component, you will have a dispatch method with it. Now using map dispatch to prop function, we can work with the dispatch actions. Let me show you how. Here I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to say here constant map dispatch to props. Now you are free to specify any name to this function. That's upon you. And I'm going to specify here parameter call dispatch and pass here a function like this. Inside this function, I'm going to return an object. So I'm going to say here return and pass here object. And inside this object, I'm going to pass my dispatch methods. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create here a key called increment and specify a dispatch method to it. So I'm going to pass here a function and add a function like this and call dispatch method. So I'm going to access this parameter value here, dispatch, and pass parenthesis. And inside this parenthesis, as you know, I have here increment and decrement action. I'm going to pass both these actions inside this parenthesis. But just now, let me just add here hard-coded action. So I'm going to specify here object and specify type. It is a type of increment, and then specify here comma and pass payload. Payload is going to be 1. If I open my action, you can notice here I'm going to specify type increment and payload is going to be this value. So I'm going to pass here payload 1 for now, and type is going to be increment. Let me create my second key. I'm going to pass here comma, copy this complete statement and paste it here. And instead of increment, this time I'm going to say here decrement. And let me just add a suffix to both these functions. Here I'm going to say increment props, and this became decrement props. Instead of increment, I'm going to just use this decrement action type right here. And just for that, I'm going to pass this map dispatch to props function as a second argument to this connect function. Here I'm going to pass this function map dispatch to props. Back to my component and reload it. When I reload my browser and open my component, you can notice here inside my props, here I have two methods. So this function is going to create two methods inside my component with dispatch method. Now let me just use both these methods inside my component. You know that inside my component, I have here increment and decrement handler functions. You know that we just pass that functions, or you can say methods, to this onClick event. Now let me just comment both these functions, and I'm going to access this decrement and this increment method. So just down here, I'm going to say this dot props dot decrement, and this became this props dot increment. And then I'm going to change these methods. As you know, we have increment props and decrement props. So I'm going to say here decrement props, and this became increment props. When I click on this plus button, you can notice this will just call the increment action with the payload 1. So as you can see here, I don't need to create any handler function inside my component. Using this function, we can simply pass the dispatch methods to the component as a properties. So basically, map state to props method is going to create a property and pass the current state to your component. And we're going to pass this function as a first parameter to the connect. The second parameter is the map dispatch to props. And using this function, we can call a dispatch action. You can notice here, we just created two methods inside my component. So when you pass this function as a second parameter to the connect, Redux will create both these methods inside your component. So you can call your dispatch methods. So I hope you understand both these functions clearly. Practice with it to understand how to work with both these functions. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn how to work with immutable states. So let me first explain what is the meaning of immutable. Changing the existing object or array called mutation. And on the other hand, the value that cannot be changed is called immutable. Immutable means something that cannot be changed. You all know we can update and change the object and array values in JavaScript. But there are some rules when working with pure functions to change object or array. As you know, reducer is a pure function, And in order to change your object or array, you must follow these rules. A pure function must always return the same value when giving the same input. A pure function must not have any side effect. So if you change the initial state of your store without making a copy of it, then that is the side effect of your pure reducer function. If you're using Redux, you need to know how to modify your state immutably without changing it. So let me show you how you can properly change the state of your Redux store. So I'm going to choose back to my counter, and here I'm going to change few things. Let me first get rid of this unsubscribe method from here like this. I'm going to first change this spawn tag. So instead of spawn, here I'm going to call a paragraph and pass your user name. I'm going to call here props, and to this props I'm going to create a property called user, and then I'm going to access the value of the key name. Just out of that, just down here, instead of count, as you know, I have here user property. So I'm going to specify here user, and just down here, instead of calling the type increment, I'm going to call here the type of action called add on. And I'm not going to specify any payload here. So I'm going to remove this and comment this second method like this. I'm going to save this file and back to my reducer. I'm going to change few things here as well. I'm going to change this initial state. So instead of this initial state, I'm going to just specify here user and specify an object. Inside this object, I'm going to specify ID1 and name of the user. So I'm going to say here name snow. And just like that, I don't have this action type increment. So I'm going to get rid of this increment and say here add on. Let me just add here a comment because I'm not using this decrement action. And just out of that, I'm going to get rid of this return statement. And here I'm going to say console.log and print the state. And just down here, I'm going to say return. And then I'm going to say here state equal to, and then I'm going to pass here object, user, and then I'm going to specify an object here. I'm going to add the second user. So I'm going to say here ID 2 and name is going to be daily. So when I click on the button, I'm going to call this add-on action and update the state. And I'm going to get here error, cannot read property, name of undefined. Let me just back to my example and right here. Yeah, I just added here count property. Instead of count, I'm going to say here user. So now when I reload the browser, you can notice I'm going to have here snow as a result. And when I open my console, you can notice here I have here user, the initial state with the ID1 and name is going to be snow. When I click on this plus button, this is going to update my state and I'm going to have here ID2 and name is going to be daily. This will update the UI as well. But you can notice I just specify here equal to sign to update the state. This is the illegal way in Redux to specify value to your state. By default, this will mutate the state. So to solve this problem, you have to create a new object and specify your previous state to it and then return a new state. So to do that, I'm going to get rid of this statement because this is illegal in Redux, and here I'm going to pass an object, and this object is going to return my previous state. So I'm going to say here state, and I'm going to just pass here spread operator, and just out of that specify here comma, and then I'm going to say here user, and then specify ID is going to be 2 and name is going to be daily. Save this file and click on this plus button again. You can notice this will do the same thing, but this time this is the legal way to change the state of the Redux. We are going to just use the previous state and return a new state using this reducer. And if you want to add this second user inside the state, you can change this object key. If I just specify here user2, save this file, and when I click on this plus button, you can notice I'm going to have here two objects, user1 and user2. This will just add this value in my previous state. The critical rule of immutable update is that you must make a copy of every level of nesting that needs to be updated. When you use this technique to make a copy of your state, this becomes harder when the data is nested. So to solve this problem, you can use the object assign method. So instead of this statement, I can just simply say here object dot assign. I'm going to use assign method of the object, and this method is going to take the first parameter, which is the targeted object. For now, I'm going to specify here empty object. So this assign method is going to create an empty object. Inside that, I'm going to first specify my initial state, and then I'm going to pass my updated value. So as a third argument, I'm going to specify an object here and say here user 2, and then specify ID 2 and name is going to be daily. Back to your component and reload it. When I click on this button, you can notice I'm going to have the same result. This will create 2 objects here. So using this statement, you can access your previous state as well as your new state. This method is going to create an object, specify your previous state to it, and specify a new state to it. So using this technique, you can access your previous state as well as your current state. So keep in mind, when working with object in the Redux, make sure you use this object assign method to update the value of the Redux store. So keep in mind, when working with pure function like reducer, make sure you use object assign method to update the value of the state. So keep in mind, this is the immutable rule of Redux. Practice with this code to understand it clearly. In this lecture, we're going to learn what is Redux Thunk and how to use it in the Redux application. Many times, when building a web application, you will need to call an API, which means some asynchronous action is going on. Redux Thunk is a middleware that does these asynchronous actions with Redux. Redux by itself does not allow asynchronous actions. Redux Thunk is a middleware library for Redux. Redux middleware is a code that intercepts actions coming into the store via the dispatch method. Redux Thunks return an inner function, and the inner function receives the store methods dispatch and getState as a parameter. Now, for example, let's say you create action creator, and inside that you call an API. You all know API may take some time to get the data from the server. In that case, you have to make your application asynchronous. The thunk can be used to delay the dispatch of an action or to dispatch only if a certain condition is met. Let me show you a very simple example to understand how to work with Redux Thunk library. So I'm going to just simply first install this library in my Redux application because Redux Thunk is not inbuilt. So I'm going to open my terminal. Let me first stop my development server, and here I'm going to say npm I for install Redux Thunk. When I press enter, this will install the Redux Thunk library inside my project. Once I have this library, let me clear the screen and call npm start to start the development server. And just for that, let me just back to my store.js and create a new example here. So let me get rid of all this code from here, and here I'm going to first import the create store and apply middleware functions. And just for that, just down here, I'm going to first create a variable initial store and specify initial value to it. So I'm going to say here x is equal to 1. So I'm going to pass value to this x property. Just out of that, I'm going to create a reducer function inside this store. If you want, you can create a dedicated file for the reducer function as well. That's upon you. But just for this example, I'm going to put here reducer function. So I'm going to say here constant reducer is equal to and specify an arrow function here. And as you know, reducer function have 2 parameters. First is a state and second is a action. I'm going to initialize the state with the initial value of this constant variable. Inside this reducer, I'm going to create here switch case. So I'm going to say here switch, and in the parentheses, I'm going to say action.type, and in the curly braces, I'm going to create my first case. So inside this switch case, I'm going to create my first case. So I'm going to say here case increment. When the action is equal to increment, I'm going to just increase the value of the x by 1. Just for that, let me add my second case. So just down here, I'm going to add my second case like this. So if the action is equal to decrement, I'm going to just minus 1 from this state. So just down here, I'm going to paste my third case like this. So here I'm going to say if the action is equal to reset, then I'm going to just specify one value to the state. And just out of that, at the bottom right here, I can just simply specify default case. So I'm going to say here default return state like this. So this is my simple reducer for the counter example. Just out of that, just down here, I'm going to simply call constant store is equal to create store, and inside it, as you know, we need to first pass the reducer. So I'm going to say here reducer as a first parameter, and in the second parameter, I'm going to pass my middleware. So in this lecture, we are working on Redux Thunk. So I'm going to say here apply middleware, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to pass the Thunk library. So at the top, let me first import the Thunk library here. So I'm going to say here import Thunk from, and in the single quote, I'm going to say Redux Thunk. And I'm going to just specify this function, this Thunk function inside this apply middleware like this. And just for that, don't forget to export your store. Back to your index.js, and here I'm going to leave everything as it is. Just for that, I'm going to open my counter.js, and here I'm going to change few things. So what I'm going to do is, inside my counter, let me just get rid of these comments, and inside this render statement, I'm going to just copy some JSX and paste it here like this. So I'm going to create here 3 buttons. First for the decrement, second for the increment, and third for the reset. Now here you can notice when I click on this first button, I'm going to call the handler function decrement. When I click on the second button, I'm going to call the increment. And when I click on this third button, I'm going to call the reset handler function. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use my map state to props function as well as my map dispatch to props function to pass these values. So as you know, to pass property to the component, we can use map state to props. So instead of this state to props, I'm going to change this function name for the reference, and I'm going to say here map state to props is equal to pass state to it. Let me get rid of this console, and just for that, I'm going to return x property with the value of x. So I'm going to just create a property x inside my component and pass state x value. As you know, inside my store, you can notice I have here x initial state to the store. I'm going to access that store value and specify it to this component property. And just for that, inside this map dispatch to props, I'm going to create dispatch events. So I'm going to first return the increment event. So instead of this increment props, I'm going to change this to increment like this and pass handler function. And to this handler function, I'm going to pass dispatch method and pass action type increment. I have this action type increment inside my reducer. So I'm going to call here increment, and just for that, I'm going to call here decrement and reset functions. The map dispatch to props method is going to pass all these 3 handler methods to this component. So I can access all these methods using my properties. So let me just copy first this function and pass that here. And as you know, I already have this function as a second argument to this connect. I'm going to leave everything as it is. Back to my component, save it. And here you can notice inside my constructor, I'm going to first print my component. I'm going to just back to my browser and reload it. And you can notice here, just down here, inside my counter example, inside my props, here, I'm going to have few properties: decrement, increment, reset, and x. The initial value of the x is 1 right now. Let me access all these properties and specify that. So just down here, inside my render statement, I'm going to simply create here a constant variable. And I'm going to just destructure all these properties. So I'm going to say here equal to sign this dot props. You can notice my example is working fine. When I click on the plus button, it will increase the counter value. And when I click on the minus button, it will decrease the counter value. And when I click on the reset, it will reset the counter value to 1. Now let's suppose when you click on this plus button, you want to get the value from the API and increase the value of the counter. When you get the value from the API, it will make some delay in the execution. To handle this asynchronous behavior of the action, we need to make action in the Redux thunk structure. So let me show you how to create a thunk function in the Redux application. Thunk function is just like action creator. For example, let's say here I just specify the hard-coded action. Let me create here action creator. So if I create here a function increment and specify here return type increment, then this is what we call the action creator. If you want, you can put this function in a dedicated file as well as an action creator. For this example, I'm going to leave this as it is, and this is what we call the action creator. And I'm going to just specify this function inside this dispatch parenthesis like this. The thunk function is similar to this action creator, but the thunk function is not going to return an object. Instead, it will return the function. Let me show you. Just down here, I'm going to create the thunk function, or you can say a thunk middleware function. So here I'm going to create a function. I'm going to name it increment async. That's upon you. You can name anything to this function. As I said, thunk function is going to return a function. So I'm going to just say here an arrow function, and this function is going to take a dispatch method as an argument. So I'm going to say here dispatch like this. And just for that, inside this function, you can access your dispatch method. So for example, you just make the API call here, and the API is going to make a request and get the response after 2 seconds. So I'm not going to make here API call. Instead, I'm going to call here set timeout function. So to mimic the API, I'm going to call here set timeout function. So I'm going to just say here set timeout, and inside this parenthesis, I'm going to pass here callback function like this. And as a second argument, I'm going to pass the timeout value. So I'm going to say here 2 seconds. So I'm going to pass 2000 here. And inside this parenthesis here, I'm going to say dispatch. I'm going to call this dispatch parameter right here like this. And inside it, I'm going to call my action just like this. That's it. Your thunk function is completely ready. Now you just have to use this function inside this dispatch. So here I'm going to say increment sync. When I click on this plus button, you can notice it's going to update the counter value after 2 seconds. Now what if I click on this increment and suddenly click on this decrement? Let me show you. If I click on this increment and suddenly click on this decrement, you can notice the increment sync is going to get the current value of the store. So practice with this code to understand it more clearly. If you want to know more about Redux Thunk, just head on to Redux Thunk GitHub repository, and here you can find more about this library. So I hope you understand how to work asynchronously in the Redux application. Next, we're going to see a similar library of Redux, which is Redux Saga. Now, in this lecture, we're going to learn another useful library, which is Redux Saga. So what is the use of this library? This library manages the Redux side effect. Redux Saga is similar to Redux Thunk, but there are some differences between both these libraries. If you want me to make a tutorial on it, you can just comment me below. Redux Sagas are implemented using generator functions. We all know to create a generator in JavaScript, we first specify the function keyword followed by the asterisk that defines the generator function. Generators are functions that can be exit and later be re-entered. The generator function's body is executed until the first yield expression, which specify the value to be returned from the iterator. So let me show you a very simple example to understand how to work with Redux Saga in the Redux application. So I'm going to open a new tab, and inside it, I'm going to head on to reduxsaga.js.org. And from this website, you can get the Redux Saga library. So just click on this Get Started and install the Redux Saga in your project. So I'm going to back to my project and open my terminal, stop the development server, clear the screen, and here I'm going to say npm install Redux Saga. Let me install this library inside my project. Now, once I install it, let me clear the screen and start my development server again. Let me just back to my previous example and show you how you can work with Redux Saga. So to understand Redux Saga, you need to first back to your store, and inside it, you need to first import the create Saga middleware. So at the top here, you just need to first import create Saga middleware from Redux Saga. I'm going to call create Saga middleware. So from the Redux Saga library, I'm going to import create Saga middleware. So once I import this function, just down here, before this create store at the top, I'm going to create the Saga middleware. So to do that, you just need to say here constant and create a simple variable here. So I'm going to just simply specify name to this variable, which is Saga middleware is equal to, and you need to call this function create Saga middleware like this. And just for that, you need to just specify this Saga middleware inside this apply middleware parenthesis. So let me just copy this Saga middleware variable and pass that here. And just after that, you need to run this Saga generator. So to do that, just after this create store, make sure you execute the generator after this statement. Once you call your create store, you can run the Saga generator. So just down here, I'm going to say Saga middleware dot run. I'm going to call the method of Saga middleware, which is run, and inside it, I'm going to call my middleware. So to create the Saga middleware, I'm going to create a new file for that. So inside this Redux folder right here, I'm going to create a new file and name this sagas.js. And inside this file, I'm going to create a middleware. So to create a middleware function, you just need to first start with the function keyword and pass asterisk to it, because we are going to create a generator. Saga library work with generators. So I'm going to create here a generator and specify name to it. I'm going to specify name watch increment async. That's upon you. You can name anything to this function. Let me just pass here export statement and use this function inside my store like this. Let me first import this file at the top. So here I'm going to say import. In the curly braces, I'm going to say watch increment sync from and specify my file path. Just out of that, I'm going to save this file back to my Saga's file. Inside this file, let me create my action creator. So at the top here, I'm going to say action creator, and just up here, I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to say here function, and as you know, this is the generator. So I'm going to pass asterisk here and pass a name to it. I'm going to say here increment async. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add here say timeout function to make some delay. So at the top here, I'm going to say constant delay is equal to call here a function like this with parameter ms, means millisecond, and then I'm going to say here new promise. I'm going to return a promise object with this function, and I'm going to say here response. Promise is going to take a response as a parameter. So I'm going to say here response set timeout, and inside this set timeout, I'm going to pass response and millisecond. Just out of that, here inside this increment, I'm going to pass yield delay, and I'm going to pass millisecond here 2000. So this statement will execute this function after 2 seconds. This yield keyword is used in JavaScript to pause and resume the generator function. So once the generator executes this function after 2 seconds, it will call its second statement. So just after this first statement, I'm going to call here my second statement. So I'm going to say here yield, and here I'm going to call the Saga effect. In Saga, there are some effects you can use when working with Saga library. So at the top, I'm going to say import in the curly braces. I'm going to say put specify comma and say here take every from in the single quote. I'm going to say Redux Saga. From the Redux Saga, I'm going to get both these effects from the effect directory. So I'm going to pass here Redux Saga effect, and then I'm going to pass this put right here. So I'm going to say here put in the parentheses. I'm going to pass my action. So I'm going to say here type, and it is a type of increment. Now put is one example of what we call an effect. Effect are plain JavaScript object which contains instruction to be fulfilled by the middleware. When a middleware retrieves the effect yielded by the Saga is pauses until the effect will fulfilled. There are different effects in Saga. Put is one of them. Just out of that, we have here take every effect. I'm going to use that inside this watch increment sync function. So you can notice here, I'm going to have here my action creator, and inside this watch increment sync, I'm going to call this action creator and create a new action. So inside this function, I'm going to say yield take every. I'm going to call an effect of Saga. The take every is a helper function provided by Redux Saga to listen for dispatch action and run your action every time, or you can say and run your action each time. So inside this parenthesis, inside a single quote, I'm going to say increment async. I'm going to create here an action increment async, and to this action I'm going to pass action creator increment async, this one. So what I'm going to do is here I'm going to create a new action called increment sync, and now just out of that, I'm going to save all the changes back to my counter, and inside it you can notice here I have here increment async as a dispatch action creator. Let me get rid of it, and here instead of increment sync, I'm going to say here increment. So I'm going to just simply pass this type increment to this increment method, and as you know, inside my Sagas here I have increment sync action. I'm going to pass that to this action type. So I'm going to just copy this increment async and pass that to this type like this. Let me save this file. When I click on this plus button, you will notice after 2 seconds, you can notice counter will update its value by 1. Let me click on the increase button again. You can notice after 2 seconds, counter will update its value. So this example is now completely asynchronous. So now whenever you get the value from the API call, you don't have to worry about anything. Your example is now asynchronous. So I hope you understand 2 different ways to make your Redux application asynchronous. In the previous lecture, we understand how to work with Redux Thunk, and in this lecture, we understand how to work with Redux Saga. So I hope you understand both these lectures clearly. If you want to know more about Redux Saga, comment me below. I will make more videos on it. Now, From this lecture, I'm going to show you how to create a simple Redux application in React. Until now, we all know how to work with Redux, but let me show you how you can use the Redux in the React application. So I'm going to create a simple project inside my Visual Studio Code editor and show you how you can work with Redux application. So let me just create a new project inside my application folder. So here inside my MERN series, I'm going to open my terminal, and inside my terminal, you can notice I'm in my MERN series folder. Inside that, I'm going to create a new React project. So to create a new React project, I'm going to say npx create React app, and then I'm going to name this application Redux app. When I press enter, this command will create React application in this directory. So this command will create a simple React application. Once we have the React application, let me first cd and enter into my Redux app. So once I enter into my Redux application, let me just start the development server. So I'm going to say here npm start. So this command will simply start the development server of React. Just for that, let me close this terminal and let me open my Redux app. Here I'm going to have a few folders. What I'm going to do is inside this source folder, I'm going to create few folders. So let me just click on this new folder icon, and I'm going to first create here a folder name Redux store. Inside this Redux store, I'm going to store all my Redux files. Just for that, inside this source, I'm going to add another folder with the name components, and inside these components, I'm going to put all my components. Just for that, inside this Redux store, I'm going to create 3 subfolders. First, for the actions, second, for the reducer, and third, for the store. So inside this action, I'm going to put all my action files. Inside this reducer, I'm going to put all my reducer files, and inside this store, I'm going to have my Redux store. Now when your app grows, you will have more than one reducer and more than one action. So I'm going to separate both these files using directories. Let me create my action creator. So inside this action, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to name it index.js. That's upon you. You can name anything to this file. Inside this file, I'm going to create my action creators. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say here constant add to do success is equal to, I'm going to pass here to do parameter and pass an arrow here like this. And inside this function, I'm going to pass object. So I'm going to just return an object with this function. Let me first add here a comment to indicate this is the action creator. So inside this object, I'm going to first specify the type. So I'm going to specify here type in the capital letters. So I'm going to say here add to do success. Just for that, I'm going to specify payload, and it is a type of object. So I'm going to pass here object and pass here to do this parameter name. So when I call this add to do success, I'm going to pass this value to this action. Just for that, let me create my second action. So just for that, here I'm going to say constant add to do started is equal to, and then I'm going to pass here an arrow function. Inside it, I'm going to pass type, and it is a type of add to do started. Now I want to return this object, so I need to wrap it inside this parenthesis like this. Just for that, let me create my last action. So I'm going to say here constant add to do failure is equal to, specify here error as a parameter and pass a function here, and inside it I'm going to return an object. Inside this function, I'm going to say type. This is a type of action, and this is the add to do failure type of action. Then I'm going to pass here payload. It is going to be an object, and pass here my error parameter error. Now when creating an action creator, you need to take care of this action type. When you pass this action type, you need to specify the exact name of this action type in the reducer. So let me show you how to simplify this statement. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create the action types in a separate files. So inside this action, I'm going to create a new file and specify name for this file types.js. And inside it, I'm going to export all my actions. So here I'm going to simply say export constant and specify name of my actions. For example, inside this index, here I have add to do success. Let me copy it, specify that here, So this is now a variable, and to this variable I'm going to pass value add to do success. Back to my action creator, copy this add to do started, specify that here using export keyword, export constant add to do started is equal to, and in the double quote I'm going to pass add to do started. At the last, here I have add to do failure. Let me copy it, specify here export constant add to do failure, and in the double quote I'm going to say add to do failure. So now I can access all these three constant variables here in my action creator instead of passing these values. So at the top I'm going to just simply say import in the curly braces. Here I'm going to import all these action types. So let me just first specify here from, specify single quote and specify here types, and from these types I'm going to first add to do success, then I'm going to add to do started, and then I'm going to add to do failure. Or you can just simplify this import statement. I'm going to just get rid of all these types right from here, and here I can say import star as action types. So I'm going to just import all my variables and create action type object and store all my variables inside that. So I can just simply access my all variables using this object. So instead of this hard-coded value, here I can simply say action types add to do success. Just down here I can just simply specify add to do started like this. Here I'm going to say action types dot add to do started, and just down here I can just specify action type dot add to do failure. That's easy, right? Now let's see how to create a reducer for this project. Now let me show you how to create a reducer for this project. So inside this reducer folder right here I'm going to create a new file and name this file to-dos reducer.js. That's upon you, you can name anything to this reducer file. Inside this reducer file I'm going to first initialize the initial state. So I'm going to say here a comment initial state, and then I'm going to specify constant variable with variable name initial state is equal to, then specify an object. Inside this object I have to-dos, and this is a type of array, so I'm going to pass empty array here. Just out of that, here I'm going to say export default function, and then I'm going to pass name to this function, which is to-dos reducer. And as you know, with the reducer you will get two parameters, state and action. I'm going to pass both that, and let me first initialize this state variable with the initial value. So I'm going to say here state is equal to initial value. Inside this to-dos reducer, let me create a switch case. So I'm going to say here switch. Inside it I'm going to say action.type, and inside this curly braces I'm going to create my different cases. So let me first create my first case. Here I'm going to say case, and here I'm going to pass my action types. You all know we have a dedicated file for the action types. Let me use that here. So let me open my to-dos reducer. At the top I'm going to say import star as action types from, and in the single quote double dot / to locate the action folder, and then I'm going to specify types file name like this. And here in this case I can simply say action types dot, and then I'm going to specify my action type here. You can notice I can access my constant variable here. So I'm going to first access this started variable, action type started. So I'm going to say here action type dot add to do started, and this is my first case. So I'm going to specify here colon, and inside this case I'm going to return an object. I'm going to return the previous state. So I'm going to specify here a spirit operator with a state variable. Now let me just pass a few more properties to this initial state. Instead of just to-dos, I can simply create here a property called loading, and this is right now false. I can change the value of this loading to true when the action add to do started. So just on here I'm going to specify comma, and then I'm going to say here loading is equal to true. So when this action happen, I'm going to change this loading value to true. Just out of that, let me create my second case. Just down here I'm going to create here a case, specify action types dot to do success, and to this to do success I'm going to return object, and inside this object I'm going to first return my previous state like this, and then I'm going to return loading false. So what I'm going to do is, when I call add to do started, I'm going to return the initial state. When I call the action add to do success, I'm going to return the initial state as well as change the loading value to false. And I'm going to specify here to do's, and inside an array I'm going to pass my state. So just down here I'm going to say triple dot spread operator, specify here state, then specify dot to do's. As you know, we have this property in this initial state. Let me just access it. So just out of that, I'm going to specify here comma and say here action dot payload. So when I call this action, I can get this payload value, and I'm going to pass that to this to do's. Oops, I think I misspelled the dot here like this. Just out of that, let me create my third case here, and this is the action types dot add failure, specify colon, and here I'm going to return an object with the previous state. So I'm going to pass here previous state like this, and then I'm going to return the loading is going to be false, and as well as with this state I'm going to return an error message. So let me add this error property inside my initial state. Here I'm going to say error and specify initial value now. Don't forget to add comma here, and just down here I'm going to say error and pass action dot payload dot error. Now when I call this action, I'm going to pass my action payload error value to this state error property. Now let me save this file and create a store for this reducer. So I'm going to create a new file inside this store and name this file store.js. And now let me create a new store here. So to create a store, I'm going to first import the create store function. So I'm going to say here import create store from, in the single quote I'm going to specify Redux. But as you know, I don't have this Redux package in my application. So before we import this function from this package, I need to first install this package in my project. So let me first open my terminal, stop this development server, and here I'm going to say npm I for install and install Redux. As well as I'm going to install React Redux. This package is going to help us to add provider and provide the store to all my React components. Just out of that, we also need React Thunk. We all know how to work with React Thunk in the previous lecture. Now let me just click on enter and install all these three packages in my project. Once I have all these three packages in my project, I can use it. Let me first start my development server like this. And now if I specify here Redux, then I can access my Redux package here like this. Just down here, I'm going to create a command and say create a store. As you know, to create a store, you need to create a constant variable store and pass a function create store. Or you can just export this create store as well. That's upon you. So I'm going to say here create store, and inside it, I'm going to pass my reducer as a first parameter. As you know, I don't have reducer inside this file. So let me first import that. So I'm going to say here import to-dos reducer from, specify single quote, double dot to locate this reducer folder, and then I'm going to specify to-dos reducer. Let me use this to-dos reducer right here as a first parameter. And just out of that, I'm going to export default store. Back to your main index file. So let me minimize everything back to my index file. And right now, this application is rendering this app component. Let me change it and create my own component inside it. So inside the source folder here, inside these components, I'm going to create a new file and name this file to-do creator.js. And I'm going to just specify here a simple functional component. So I'm going to say here React functional component. Inside it, I'm going to say h2 heading tag, and I'm going to say here to-do Redux application. Save this file back to the index, and let me first import my component. Here I'm going to first say here import statement, and I'm going to first import my to-do creator. From, I'm going to specify the component folder, then I'm going to specify to-do creator. Let me specify this component right here. Just out of that, let me just add a provider here at the top. I'm going to say import. In the curly braces, I'm going to say provider from, and as you know, we have the provider in React Redux module. I'm going to specify that here, and instead of this React strict mode, I can just simply pass here provider, just like this. And at the end, let me add my store here. From in the single quote, I'm going to specify the Redux store. Inside it, I have the store file. So I'm going to say here a property store is equal to, and then I'm going to pass the store variable. Save all my files. Now at the last, I need to connect this to-do creator to the store. So I'm going to just back to my component to-do creator. Let me show you the properties of these components. To get the properties of your functional component, you need to pass here props parameter, and using it, you can access all the properties of this component. So I'm going to say here console.log, and I'm going to print all the properties. So I'm going to say here props. Let me reload the browser, and you can notice here inside it, I don't have any property to this component. Let me connect this component to the store and add a dispatch method as well as some other properties. So I'm going to just add here connect function and connect this component to the store. Instead of adding the connect function just down here, I'm going to create a dedicated file for that, because with connect function, you can pass two parameters, map state to props and map dispatch to props. I'm going to use both that functions. So instead of creating a connect function here, I'm going to create a new file for that. So inside my store, here I'm going to create a new file and name it container.js. I'm going to just simply say export default, and I'm going to just export the connect function. As you can see, when I pass here connect, Visual Studio Code will automatically add the import statement at the top. Right now, I'm not going to pass anything, so I'm going to leave this parenthesis as it is, and inside the second parameter, I'm going to pass my to-do creator. So let me first import that component here. So I'm going to say here import to-do creator from, in the single quote, double dot /, then specify my component folder. Inside it, I have to-do creator. Let me pass that as a second parameter right here. Save this file and just back to your main index file right here. And instead of this to-do creator, I'm going to just get this to-do creator from the container right from here. So let me get rid of this component file, specify here Redux store, specify store folder and container like this. Save this file, back to your project and reload it. You can notice when I reload, I'm going to have the dispatch method with it. I can access now the dispatch method of the store. So this is how you can work with different files in the Redux application. Next, we're going to create a thunk middleware for this application. Now, let's take a look at how to create a Redux thunk middleware in this application. So what we need to do is, we need to first back to the store. You all know, we already installed the Redux thunk package in this project in the previous lecture. So I'm not going to install it again. If you don't have Redux thunk in your project, just head on to your terminal and type npm I for install and then specify Redux thunk. This command will install this Redux thunk package in your project. At the top, let me first import the Redux thunk. So here, I'm going to first create a command and say Redux thunk. As you know, we use Redux thunk to create asynchronous actions. So I'm going to say here import. I'm going to specify here Redux thunk. So in the single quote, here I'm going to say Redux thunk, and I'm going to install a package from the Redux which is thunk. And I'm going to pass this Redux thunk as a second parameter to this create store. As a second parameter here, I'm going to pass a middleware. As you know, we can pass a middleware using apply middleware function. So at the top, inside this create store, I'm going to first import the apply middleware function and pass that here. So I'm going to say apply middleware, and in the parentheses of this apply middleware, I'm going to specify here my thunk library. Now I can create any asynchronous middleware in this application. Let me save this file and back to my index.js inside my action folder. Right here, you can notice I have 3 actions here. Let me create thunk middleware at the top. So at the top here, I'm going to create a thunk middleware. So I'm going to say here add to do thunk middleware. So here I'm going to first create a function. So I'm going to say here export constant function, and I'm going to specify name to this function, add to do, and just specify the arrow function here. Inside this function, as you know, thunk middleware is going to return a function. So I'm going to say here return, and I'm going to return here a function with the parameter dispatch. With the thunk middleware, you can access dispatch parameter. So here I'm going to say dispatch and call an arrow function here like this. Now using this function, I can execute any dispatch action. So I'm going to simply say here dispatch, and in this parenthesis, I can call this action creators. So inside this parenthesis, I'm going to call this add to do started. Oops, I think I misspelled here started. Let me copy this function name, paste it here, and just call this action here. So when the application started, I'm going to first call this add to do started action. Now let me save this middleware and pass this middleware to the component. So I'm going to first save this file and back to my container.js right here, container.js inside the store folder. Here I'm going to create two functions, and I'm going to pass that to this connect function. As you know, to this connect function, we can pass two parameters, map state to props and map dispatch to props. So at the top, I'm going to create both these functions. Let me first leave everything as it is and show you the properties of this to-do creator. I'm going to just back to my browser, and when I reload it, you can notice I'm going to have a message cannot call class as a function. Whoops, I think I misspelled something in my program. Let me back to my project and let me open the index.js. Let me open the container store. Yeah, right here. I just misspelled the package name as well as I installed the wrong package inside this project. I used to do this type of mistake. So let me just get rid of this package from here. Let me check my package.json file. Inside it, here I'm going to have a package called React Thunk. Instead of this, we need Redux Thunk. So let me uninstall this package from this project and install the Redux Thunk inside this project. Let me open a terminal, stop the development server, and here I'm going to say npm uninstall, and I'm going to uninstall this React Thunk package. So here I'm going to say React Thunk, and instead of React Thunk, I'm going to say npm install, and I'm going to install here Redux Thunk. This is the correct package. Let me close this file, and you can notice here I have a Redux Thunk package in my package.json. Let me use it. Let me close this package.json, and inside this store right here, I'm going to say Redux Thunk. Save this file, open my terminal, and start my development server. As you can notice, I'm going to have here my title, and inside my console, I'm going to have the properties of this component. What I want, inside this container right here, I'm going to pass two functions to this connect and pass properties to this to-do creator component. So just down here, I'm going to create here first a component map state to props. So just down here, I'm going to say constant map state to props is equal to specify state and pass a function here. Inside it, I'm going to return an object with to-do's key and pass a state to it. Just after that, I'm going to pass this function as a first argument to this connect function, just like this, map state to props. Just down here, I'm going to create another function called map dispatch to props. So I'm going to say here constant map dispatch to props is equal to dispatch. As you know, with this function, we're going to get the dispatch parameter. So I'm going to call that and return a simple object. Inside this object, I can simply create a property for the component. So I'm going to say here on add to do and pass a function here, a callback function. So when I call this key, I'm going to call this function. Inside this function, I'm going to simply call dispatch, and in the parenthesis, I'm going to call my to do add middleware. As you know, we have this to do add middleware inside my index file. Here you can notice inside this action index file, I have here add to do. Let me just use this middleware inside my container. So here at the top, I'm going to say import. I'm going to say here in the curly braces add to do from, and in the single quote, I'm going to say //action and specify index file. As you know, in the index file, we just exported this add to do. So I'm going to access that inside this container. Just for that, let me pass this function inside this dispatch, just like this. Just for that, let me pass this function as a second argument to this connect. Back to my component and reload it. You can notice here I'm going to have few properties to this component. I'm going to have on add to do and to do's state. Right now the value of this state is undefined because in the reducer we did not specify the default case. So I'm going to just back to my project and open the to do's reducer, and you can notice here I don't have here a default case. So just after this case, this last case right down here, I'm going to create my default case. So I'm going to say here default, and down here I'm going to return a simple state. Back to my browser and reload it. You can notice now I have my state. So inside this to do creator component, I'm going to have on add to do function, as well as I'm going to have to do's state. So I can access my store value using this property to do's and call the dispatch method using this on add to do function. Let me show you how to do it. So what I want to call this function, or you can say this dispatch method when I click on the button. I'm going to back to my to do creator, and here I'm going to create a button. So just out of this h2 heading tag, here I'm going to create a division tag, and inside it I'm going to create a button. To this button I'm going to specify name, change, action, or you can specify any name to this button, that's upon you. And here I'm going to create on click event and pass the handler function. As you know, I don't have handler function here, so let me create that. At the top I'm going to say constant on click happened is equal to, and pass an arrow function here. Inside this, as you know, we have this on to do method. We can access this on to do method with the properties. So here I'm going to say props dot on add to do, like this. And just for that I'm going to specify this on click happen to this on click event, like this. Back to my browser and reload it. When I click on the change action button, it will call this on add to do middleware function. And as you know, inside this middleware function we have this dispatch. So when you call the change action, it will call this middleware function and call the add to do started action. You can notice here inside your reducer, you just return the initial state and you change the value of this loading to true. The initial value of this loading is false, but when you click on the change action, it will change the loading value to true. You can notice here. And when you click on the change action, it will change the loading value to true. And rest of the properties are same because we did not change anything inside that. Now if you want, you can call here use effect hook and call this on to do inside that. That's upon you. Now I hope you understand how to create a simple Redux middleware. Next we're going to implement this middleware and we're going to make the API call inside this middleware. Now once you understand how to create this simple middleware inside your application, let me show you how to make API call using this middleware. As you know, when you call an API, you need to make sure your application is asynchronous. Otherwise, you will get an error messages. Because API call will take some time to return the response from the server. So to call the API in this JavaScript project, I'm going to just call here a library called Axios. So let me first install that library inside this project. So I'm going to open my terminal, stop the development server, and here I'm going to say npm I for install, and I'm going to install Axios library. Axios is a library that helps us to make HTTP requests to the external resources. In our React application, we often need to retrieve data from the external APIs, so it can be displayed in our web pages. So we're going to use this library to call the APIs from the external resources. And now inside this middleware, I'm going to create my API call. So just out of this add to do started, just down here, I'm going to call Axios library. Now to call this library, you need to first import that at the top. So here I'm going to say import Axios from Axios library. So just down here, I'm going to call the Axios library, and with this library, you will get different HTTP requests. So I'm going to first call here post method, Axios.post. So this method is going to make post requests to the API. Inside this parenthesis, you need to first specify the URL, then specify the data, and that will return the response as a promise. So as a first argument here in this single code, I'm going to pass the API URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my browser, and here I'm going to open a new tab and search for JSON placeholder. And from this JSON placeholder fake API
testing tool, I'm going to call the API inside my project. To know more about this API, just head on to jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. So I'm going to just click on the guide and import this API inside my project. As you can notice here, to use this API, you can use the fetch function as well. If you want, you can use the fetch function to fetch the data from this API. That's upon you. I'm using the Axios library here. So just on here, you can notice here, we have the create a resource section. Inside this section, we have here the API to make a post request. Let me use this API. So let me copy this URL and I'm going to back to my project, and inside this single quote, here I'm going to paste that URL, the post request URL. I'm going to pass here comma and pass the second parameter. And as a second parameter right here, we need to pass the data with this post request to post some data inside this API. So here I'm going to pass an object, and inside this object, I'm going to specify first title, full, then I'm going to specify here body, which is bar. This is just the values. You can specify any value here, and then specify here user ID is going to be 1. Now once I have my post values here, just out of this second parameter right here, after this parenthesis, just down here, I'm going to pass here dot and call then method. I hope you know, when working with promises, to get the values from the API, or you can say to get the values from the promise, you need to call then method. So inside this then method, I'm going to pass a callback function. So I'm going to say here response and call a callback function here. Inside this parenthesis, I'm going to have the response of this post request. So just on here, I'm going to say console.log and I'm going to print here response.data. So using data parameter, I can access the response data of this action. Just out of that, just out of this then, down here, I can call the catch. I can call the catch here, catch method, and pass the error. So if there is any problem inside this request, I'm going to call this catch method, and inside it, I'm going to say console.log and print the error message like this. Let me save this file. And just out of that, when I click on this change action, you can notice this will return the posted data in the console. You can notice here. Let me reload the browser and show you the result again. When I click on this change action, after a few seconds, API will return the output, and I'm going to have that output inside my console. When I click on the change action, you can notice after a few seconds, API is going to return the response to our application, and I'm going to have here the output value. Now, if you want, you can pass this value to your action creator and store this value inside your state. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just back to the index.js right here inside this action. And here, instead of this console messages, I'm going to get rid of these console messages. And here I'm going to call a dispatch method. As you know, we are in this middleware function. So I can access this dispatch method inside these promises as well. So here I'm going to say dispatch. And as a parameter, I'm going to pass here add to do success, the action. And as you know, to this add to do success, we have a parameter called to do. I'm going to pass this response.data to this parameter like this. So this will just store this data in the store. Just out of that, instead of this console.log, here I'm going to call dispatch method with the action add to do failure like this. And in the parenthesis, as you know, I have here error parameter with the payload. So I'm going to pass here error message. Let me save this file back to my component first, and let me print my current state here. So at the top, I'm going to say here import. In the curly braces, I'm going to call use selector from React Redux. From this library, I'm going to call here use selector function. So this function is going to get the current state of the store. So instead of these properties, I'm going to say here constant todos is equal to use selector, and this is going to return a parameter called state, and I'm going to return that parameter like this to this todos. And just on here, I'm going to just print console.log todos. Save this file. Now this will just first print the initial state of the store. When I click on the change action, you can notice I'm going to have here a value inside my todos. You can notice here inside my todos, I'm going to have my API call value. So I'm going to just make the post request to the API and get the output from that API. And I'm going to just store that value in the store.
keep in mind, inside this middleware, this API call is not actually going to store all these values inside this API. This is just a fake API. So it will not actually going to store all these values inside this API. Instead, it will just make the mimic of it. And now once you have your values inside your store, you can print all these values inside your Redux application. So next we'll see how to do that. Now, we all know how to work with Redux Thunk middleware and work with APIs. Using this application, we use the Redux Thunk middleware to make the API call. When we click on the action, I'm going to post the data in the API and get the response from that API. Now, once we get the response from the API, let me show you how to print that in your application. So let me just back to my Visual Studio Code editor, and here you can notice I have here a console statement. Inside that, I have here to-dos variable. Inside this to-dos, I have this state object. Inside this object, we have error, loading, and to-dos array. Inside this to-dos, right now I don't have anything. But when I click on this change action, I'm going to have value inside this to-dos. You can notice here. Inside this to-dos, I have one to-do with title, body, user ID, and ID. I'm going to post this data in the API and get the response back from the API. And then I'm going to store that data in the store. What I want to get this data from the store and display that right here in my application. So what I'm going to do is, just out of this title, I'm going to print all that data. I'm going to simply first create here a division tag, and inside that, I'm going to create h3 heading tag. Inside this h3 heading tag, as you know, we have here a variable called to-dos. I'm going to just call that here. And inside that, as you can notice here, I have to-dos k. Now let me just change the variable name here. Instead of to-dos, I'm going to say here container. That will make sense. Let me just change this container. Let me just change the variable name. And inside this variable, I have a state. And inside that, I have to-dos key. Inside this to-dos, on 0 index, I have to-do key. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just iterate over these to-dos using map function and display all these data. So just here, I'm going to call a method of array, which is map. This function is going to iterate over an array. So here inside this parenthesis, I'm going to pass a callback function here. And inside this callback function, I'm going to pass parameter. So for now, I'm going to specify here t for to-dos. And inside this function, I'm going to say span. And inside this span tag, right here inside this curly braces, I'm going to say t dot to-do dot title. As you can notice here, inside this array, I have this to-do key. And I'm going to access this title key value. Let me save the changes. Back to my browser. Oops, I'm not going to get anything here because we need to return this value instead of just specifying that inside this function. So instead of these curly braces, I'm going to pass here parenthesis, just like this. As you can notice, I'm going to have here foo as a response. In the console, you will notice I'm going to have here a warning. Each child in the list should have unique key. You all know how to work with this warning because in the previous lectures, we understand how to solve this warning. Let me refresh that again and show you how you can solve this warning. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just grab these curly braces right from here, cut that and paste that just after this h2 heading tag right here. And inside this right here, I'm going to create this div and h3 heading tag. And inside this function right here, I'm going to get rid of this span tag and use my division and h3 heading tag. So inside this map function right here, I'm going to create a division tag, and inside this, I'm going to create h3 heading tag. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to specify key to this division tag, and I'm going to specify curly braces here. Inside this curly braces, I'm going to get the index value of this to-do. You can notice here, inside your to-dos, you will get this index value. This is right now 0. I'm going to pass this value right here. So as a second argument to this map, here I'm going to specify I for index. You can specify any name to both these parameters. That's upon you. Inside this key, as a value, I'm going to specify I, the index value, to uniquely identify this division tag. And inside this h3 heading tag, here I'm going to pass curly braces, specify t for to-dos, and then I'm going to say to-do dot title and reload my browser. Just out of that, when I click on this change action, you can notice I'm not going to get any warning here. I'm going to get response what I want. Now, instead of iterating over this array inside this return statement, you can create a function for that. Or you can create a variable and return all the values of your JSX to that variable and print that variable. For a practice, put this statement inside a separate component and call that component here and print all your API values. Now let me show you how you can create a variable and store all your JSX value inside it. And using that variable, I'm going to print all my data. Let me show you what I want to say. At the top, before this return statement, here, I'm going to create a variable called constant list items is equal to, and then I'm going to pass this statement just like this instead of this curly braces. And just out of that, this statement is going to return this title with this division tag. And then what we need to do is we need to just copy this variable, and inside these curly braces you need to just print that variable. Reload the browser and try to click on the action button. So this is easy approach to get the value from the array. Just for that, if you want, you can get the different values of your to-do inside this division tag. For example, if I want to get the value of body, I can just simply specify here body key. Then if I want to get the value of ID, I can specify here ID. Back to my browser, and as you can see, I'm going to have the title, body, and the ID of the to-do list. So this variable is going to hold all these values and print that in the JSX. Now, if you want, you can style all this section using CSS file. For example, let's say you want to center this title. You can simply create a CSS file for that. Let me import the CSS file here. I'm going to say import. In the single quote, I'm going to specify // and then I'm going to specify app.css. I'm going to import this app.css file. We already have this file in this project. I'm going to use that here, and inside this file I have a few classes. I'm going to use this app class inside my project. Here I'm going to say class name is equal to, and in the double quote I'm going to say here app. As you can see, this will just center this to-do Redux application title. So if you want, you can style your application using the CSS file, or you can create a dedicated file for this component and style your application. Now I hope you understand how basically the Redux application works.